Hi everybody. So today we have a very special guest. I guess that here in Portugal today everyone is flocking to Fatima because today it's a special day for Catholics worldwide because it's the date where supposedly there was an apparition of the mother of Jesus Christ here in Portugal, and so I guess everyone is flocking there. Portugal is mainly Catholic, and they want to venerate the mother of Jesus Christ, but I guess I'm trying to swim against the tide. And I invited the mother of evolutionary psychology, who in fact probably knows more about most of humanity than the mother of Jesus. The mother of Jesus probably only knows about Jesus. So. Okay. So, and if you don't know her, you should, and you should be ashamed of yourself. So, okay. Okay, we have here today Dr. Leda Cosmides, who pioneered the field of evolutionary psychology. She's got a Ph.D. in cognitive psychology by the University of Harvard. She also did a postdoctoral work with Roger Shepard at Stanford and was a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. Dr. Cosmides won the 1988 American Association for the Advancement of Science Prize for Behavioral Science Research, the 1993 American Psychological Association Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship, and she is currently professor of psychology at UC Santa Barbara. She and John Tooby, her husband, founded and co-directed the UCSB Center for Evolutionary Psychology, and she's also the co-author of the great book, The Adapted Mind, Evolutionary Psychology and the Generation of Culture. So, Dr. Cosmides, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you, Ricardo. That was a lovely Mother's Day introduction.
Well, you're my favorite scientist, so I guess.
Thank you very much. I'm also the mother of Nike Tooby Cosmides, so I honor her today for making me a mother.
Okay. Today we're going to talk about evolutionary psychology, obviously, right? So to start off with, and because this is also directed toward the general public and other scientists who are not from the same field, let's say, I would like for you to tell us a little bit about the historical origins and development of evolutionary psychology. So how did it come to be, and what were the most interesting historical events behind it?
Well, okay, this will be a personal narrative, if that's all right.
Yes, of course.
So starting in the late 1960s and early 1970s, there started to be in evolutionary biology, people started to really address social behavior. It was made possible by the modern synthesis, which brought together Darwin and genetics, population genetics, and suddenly you could analyze selection pressures you could explore them in a much more analytical way than before. And so there were several things that happened. George Williams' classic book, Adaptation and Natural Selection, which had two equally important components. One was an argument about the gene as unit of selection. The other one being criteria for adaptationism, for considering something an adaptation, where he said adaptation is an onerous concept that should only be applied when there's evidence of special design, evidence that something really was designed to solve an adaptive problem. So if you've got flying fish that go up, you don't need to invoke an adaptation for them coming down. Gravity is sufficient as an explanation. And so he really laid out those foundations beautifully. And I mean, evolutionary psychology takes both of those very seriously. Now, what happened at around the same time was Hamilton's kin selection theory. And then Robert Shrivers had a series of very important papers, Parental Investment and Sexual Selection, about mating relationships across species, the evolution of reciprocal altruism, which had a lot of effect on my work, parent-offspring conflict. These were papers that really were talking about the selection pressures, taking seriously the gene as a unit of selection that are relevant to social behavior. So at that point, there started to be a field called, at that point it was called sociobiology. And sociobiology, it was not psychological, and I'll get to that in a second, but there were hubs of it. One hub was at the University of Michigan, and the other hub was with Richard Alexander, and the other hub was at Harvard, which is where I was and where John Tooby was.
Just to stop you there, was the hub associated with the University of Michigan related to behavioral genetics because of the MISTRE studies and things like that?
Because of what studies?
The MISTRE, the studies with the twins.
That was Minnesota.
Oh,
that's
right.
Tom Bouchard at Minnesota. Dick Alexander was an evolutionary biologist. It is an evolutionary biologist who focused on insects, insect societies. So at Harvard, there was around 1975. Ed Wilson's book Sociobiology came out and caused a but actually, the community at Harvard for sociobiology was not around him because he was busy writing his books. Irvin DeVore, who's an anthropologist who started a lot of different things. He was one of the first people to study baboon society, not from a behaviorist perspective, but as a social anthropologist would. And then he really opened up hunter-gatherer studies, and with amazing projects studying Kung San people in Botswana, where he brought people from all kinds of different fields in to study simultaneously all aspects of their way of life, from linguistics to child development to social behavior, politics, everything. It was we all assumed that was going to be how anthropology proceeded in the future. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. But then the third thing was Irv got interested in sociobiology. And so he had at his home, he had something called the Simian Seminar, which was almost like a salon in the sense that you read about salons in Europe in the 1800s and 1700s. And this was every person who was interested in evolution behavior from around the world at some point came through Irv DeVore's living room and gave a Simian seminar. It was a graduate seminar. So that's, you could sit there. It's like when they say that at a certain corner in Manhattan, at some point, if you sit there long enough, you'll see everybody in the world. That's what Irv's living room was like. So at some point, you would hear Bill Hamilton and John Maynard Smith. These are, two of the most well-known evolutionary biologists of the time. Richard Dawkins came through. Anybody that you want to hear who had anything to do with evolution and behavior, you would hear in the Simian Seminar. So he created this community, very amazing community of graduate students and faculty, and it was cross-disciplinary, which we thought was normal. I met John there. He was a few years older than me, and he was a graduate student when I was an undergraduate. And I met him, I guess, my senior year. I knew who he was my junior year. John Tooby's my husband and collaborator. Before then, I just knew him as there would be some vigorous conversation going on, and as an undergraduate, I would raise my hand, whereas graduate students just jump in, and so I'd be kind of frustrated because it was something I wanted to say that would be very, very different from what everybody else was saying. And then this annoying graduate student would say exactly what I was about to say, and that was John. So anyway, that's where we met. That's also where we met Martin Daly and Margot Wilson, who are also very important in starting the field of evolutionary psychology. And also David Buss does evolutionary psychology of mating relationships. David was just starting to do this, and he was an assistant professor at Harvard. So John and I both were thinking that something was missing in terms of a level of explanation, because a lot of what was going on in discussions in sociobiology, because a lot of the people were from anthropology or evolutionary biology, but a lot of what was going on was jumping straight from theories of selection pressures to manifest behavior. So that's kin selection theory, and it's true that in many traditional societies, a lot of social organization, it's organized around kinship. But there was a layer of...
okay, so you were talking about...
So what had been happening around the same time that all this great stuff was happening in evolutionary biology, something else was happening in psychology, which was cognitive sciences started to arise. You had Chomsky arguing that there were mental organs, that there were mechanisms specialized for learning language. There was the rise of computers, and that was really important because suddenly there was a language for talking about the mind. That was missing before. You could see people, Piaget, struggling with how to describe mental processes. And here were these machines, and there's clearly no ghost in the machine, but these machines, computers, were doing things that are like human things. They're remembering things, they're doing inferences, making inferences, and so forth. And people started to realize, wait a minute, if you think about the mind as, and not in a spooky way, as some, and not in a dualist way, as not as ectoplasm or something like that, but you could think of it as what the brain does, which is process information. And then you could start to have models that were testable of what programs are in the mind. And that was a very powerful idea that John and I were aware of. John had been a psychology major as an undergraduate because of that, because he thought it would be relevant for understanding evolutionary things. And I had come to college wanting to understand human nature, and I became aware of the cognitive revolution along the way. I was a biology major, an evolutionary biology major, because I wanted to understand behavior. But the problem with the cognitive revolution is people didn't have good models of what the brain evolved to do, about what programs should be in there. So they were going from models of tools, so a camera, understanding how the eye works, for example. Or they might make models of memory that were more like computer memory, which is ironic. That there's a RAM and there's a long-term store and so forth. And they got somewhere with some of those things, but clearly there's a lot more to what goes on in the mind than that. And what we realized was that these theories from evolutionary biology about social behavior provided, they were, many of them were theories about other things the mind should be well designed for doing, especially when game theory started to be introduced into evolutionary biology, because then you could actually analyze in a very specific way, what are the selection pressures for cooperation between two individuals who are not related to one another. So that would be, in Shriver's reciprocal altruism theory, and you had Axelrod's simulations of cooperation, famous simulations of tournaments for cooperation, or kin selection theory can thought of that way. There were started the analyses of aggressive interactions and so forth. And in addition to that, you started to have these theories that were getting very specific about aspects of social behavior. There was also increasing knowledge knowledge from all the anthropological studies about hunter-gatherer life. So many of the people in Irvin DeBoer's group had studied Kung San people, and people would come through who had studied all kinds of more traditional societies, some hunter-gatherer, some hunter-horticulturalists. And of course, no one of these societies is the model at all for human evolution, but you could start to piece it together with general models from behavioral ecology of other species to get a picture of, well, what would hunter-gatherer life have looked like for our ancestors? And what kind of information would have been available in these ancestral environments that would allow psychological adaptations for helping kin or for engaging reciprocation that would allow those to work. And so you could really start to piece together a task analysis, an analysis of adaptive problems that included both what the problem is, like cooperation with unrelated people, reciprocation, for example, and knowledge about the environments in which it occurred to guide your research. And so you could do what a cognitive scientist who studied vision, who unfortunately died early, David Marr, he called it a theory of the computation, a theory of what the mechanism is, a mechanism that exists should exist is doing, which he distinguished from the algorithm and representations that actually solve the problem. So it's a theory of the problem. You have to appreciate the problem before you can go looking for the cognitive solution, was the idea. And that meant you could also have more a priori theories about what to look for. So you didn't have to just stumble around hoping to find something. You could have developed theories about what programs should be in the head, and aspects of them can be wrong, but it tells you something about what you should look for. And then you just use whatever methods are available in cognitive psychology, social psychology, experimental economics, whatever methods exist to try to see, well, do we have any evidence for programs like this in the human mind? How do they develop? What is their adult form, et cetera? And so that's also where we had, like I said, where we had met. So we talked a lot with Martin Daly and Margaret Wilson, with David Buss and so forth. This was while we were graduate students, later graduate students. And then we just continued. When we left Harvard for Stanford, we continued to talk with them, and also with Don Simons, who wrote one of the earliest books on evolutionary psychology, The Evolution of Human Sexuality. And Don is from Santa Barbara. Don's one of the reasons why we ended up in Santa Barbara. And so we would meet with Don and Martin and Margot, primarily, down in the desert in Southern California, or else in Santa Barbara every year to talk about this new field that we thought should exist. Because the problem from our point of view was that sociobiology was missing this level of explanation, because it was missing the level of explanation of the cognitive mechanism to generate behavior. Because obviously, we're not like rigid automata. Our behavior is very sensitively contingent on the information from our environment. And so you need to understand those mechanisms if you want to understand how people behave. People behave differently in different environments and in different cultures, obviously. If you want to understand that, you need to understand the programs that are processing that information, what information they're taking in, what inferences they're drawing, what motivations they're activating, and so forth, to understand how people behave. Otherwise, you're just going to have the vague correspondences between selection pressures and behavior without that level. Mm-hmm. And so we started writing papers that were about why you need that level, and then trying to demonstrate how you could find things in the mind that you never would have looked for otherwise, by taking this approach. This did not make people happy. Very controversial. I kept Don and I unemployed for a number of years. but somebody had to do it. Fortunately, Martin and Margot already had jobs at McMaster in Canada, and Don was already employed at University of California, Santa Barbara, and David Buss at University of Michigan, and then Texas at the time. But we were hanging on by our fingernails for a while. And so just from, I mean, that's more of a, other people might have different narratives about how it came to be. I mean, I remember sitting in a bungalow in Santa Barbara with Don Simons and Martin Bailey, Margot Wilson, and John and I, and we were talking about what to call the field because it seemed different than sociobiology. It was focused on the mind. It was focused on psychology, and we were talking about Darwinian psychology, evolutionary psychology, and so forth. So I remember we were musing that if a meteor hit that bungalow at that moment, this field would be pretty much wiped out. I mean, there had been efforts ever since Darwin. There had been efforts to apply Darwinian thinking to psychology, but they often didn't go very far because there wasn't the language of information processing to where you could make hypotheses precise enough that you could test them and make things go forward. It was that was the key to, I think, the key missing ingredient. And the ethologists had information processing language to some extent. They didn't talk about it that way, but they did. And so all of those things kind of came together to create evolutionary psychology. And then we had to show it can actually help you. So I mean, that's my dissertation that was the goal of my dissertation, was to find a topic that would lead to results that nobody would have ever predicted otherwise, and show how you could find new things by taking this, because you can argue all you want philosophically about how things should work, but nobody will care if you can't show that it'll lead you to find something new and different or ask different questions. So I think of what John and I do is we don't have a single research area. Basically, we'll do something like in social exchange. It was reasoning about social exchange and detecting mechanisms specialized for detecting cheaters. But then, you give a talk about that, and people might say, well, okay, that's fine. I mean, the people are not yelling at you, but they might say, okay, that's fine. But what you're talking about, it can't help me in my area. I do visual attention. So then with another student, we'll do something on visual attention. So with our student, Josh New, we did stuff on showing that there seems to be a attentional system that's specialized for monitoring non-human animals. Something that's almost like an appendix in the human mind. It's not particularly useful right now, but it's something you would expect to be there for hunters and hunter-gatherers who are either needing to get animals as prey or to avoid becoming prey themselves. And so we go from area to area saying, oh yeah, you don't think so? You don't think this will help you? So it's trying to see how many different directions we can push this, make demonstrations of its usefulness.
Yeah, but you were saying that nobody cares if you're just doing philosophy of the mind, let's say, without any solid evidence to back it up. But I would say people care if you smoke a cigar and blame your mother for your sexual misconduct, let's say.
They care some. That's true.
Right?
Yes. True. Yes.
Okay. So
that's actually. Can I just say that raises your Freudian reference raises an interesting thing that's been part of evolutionary psychology from the beginning, and evolution and behavior more generally, because there are people who do evolution and behavior that are not, they don't think of themselves as specifically evolutionary psychology. There are evolutionary anthropologists and so forth. And one of the things that's been true since the beginning of, for example, the Human Behavior and Evolution Society is, and our center, the Center for Evolutionary Psychology, is we've always welcomed people from all disciplines. So because any discipline that relies on some conception of human nature can benefit from a decent conception of human nature. So early on, we had graduate students from English literature appearing at our lab group saying, well, in literary criticism, we always rely on theories of human nature, and usually it's Freud. And one of the students said, so I thought maybe we should have a correct one, and showed up at our lab group. And we've had people from film studies, we've had people from economics, from political science, we had somebody from Denmark recently who works on horror films. Any area of the humanities or social sciences where you need to understand something about human nature, it's a nexus. It brings all of those things together. And I think one of the strengths of evolutionary psychology as a field has been, though, the way that it's tied to all these different areas, philosophy included. So yes, no, I personally do think that theoretical foundations of a discipline are hugely important, because otherwise you can just waste an immense amount of time doing things that will turn out to be fruitless. And I hope we haven't. But yeah, there's a lot of people that are kind of a show me the money kind of thing. Show me how I can find something new. And so we had to do both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess people from the humanities now and then have to consider the hypothesis that perhaps the cigar is just a cigar. now and then, at least.
Yes.
Or perhaps the person who's smoking it is just performing some sort of costly signaling or something like that.
Yes, exactly.
Okay,
Exactly.
Okay, so in the early 90s, you edited that great book, The Adapted Mind, with your husband and Jerome Barkow, and there you try to differentiate evolutionary psychology from what you then called the standard social science model. So, please correct me if I'm wrong here, but I would say that the main traits of the standard social science model are the fact that they consider the mind to be as a blank slate, relativism, social constructionism, cultural determinism, and things like that. So, what do people need to know more about this model that was really prevalent during the last century, and it haven't gone away yet?
It has not gone away. One of our former students used to say the standard social science straw man until he got a job at an elite university and kept bumping into the straw man in the halls of his psychology department. Yes, the beginning of our paper in the Adapted Mind, the Psychological Foundations of Culture, where we defined what we mean by the standard social science model. This was, in some sense, John's cri de coeur from his first year in graduate school in anthropology of what seemed to be the problem with many of the approaches he was being taught. And it's the same thing. I was having the same thing in psychology, but yeah, I mean, I worked in a behaviorist lab actually as an undergraduate, but it was a behaviorist lab where people were realizing that a blank slate view of, well, they wouldn't have said the mind because that's taboo and behaviorism, but a blank slate view was not explaining their data. So when you're sometimes there are assumptions in a field, and this is across fields in this case, that are so deep and they're so implicit that nobody knows that they're making those assumptions. And so when that happens, you have to dig them up and shed light on them. And so the beginning of that, where we gave it a name, the Standard Social Science Model, which sounds a little bit SSSM, a little bit sinister. The SS, S&M, I mean, that was partly on purpose. Well, because everybody thinks it's so nice, and it's not necessarily so nice. But what we were trying to do is, look, if there's a lot of intelligent people who believe something, there's probably some intelligent reasons why they believe it. And so if you're trying to understand the foundations of a discipline, even if it's something that you don't agree with, you need to first do some anthropology of that discipline and understand why are these people, why are intelligent people, what brought them to think of the mind this way? Why? And there were some good and interesting reasons. You see that you could take a baby from any society and you grow it up in another society, and that baby is like the people in the society it grows up in, and so forth. People didn't have so much the view of the mind as an information processing machine, and so they didn't necessarily realize that they would say things like, well, a constant can't explain a variable. So how can a universal human nature explain cross-cultural variability? And, well, it can, but to understand that, you need to be able to see the mind as a system that processes information. Otherwise, it will be very puzzling. They would say, it seemed obvious that, how do I put this? There are problems like the one that Chomsky talked about Chomsky used the term the poverty of the stimulus, where he said, look, the fragmentary bits of speech that a child hears when they're 1 and 2 years old, it's insufficient to hone in on the particular grammar of a single language unless your mind's bringing a lot of structure to that to begin with. This whole notion of combinatorial explosion, or in AI it was called the frame problem, the problem of how the environment is underdetermined for what we end up doing, that's a really hard problem. That's for all human beings, a hard problem to wrap our minds around, because our minds are structured to think about the world in certain ways. And so it can seem like, well, obviously when this happens, you do this. And the other thing that allows you to see this is not just trying to build artificial intelligence systems, which really shows it to you, because, when people started to try to make machine vision, there's a story, and it may be a myth, but the story was that Marvin Minsky, one of the creators of the field of artificial intelligence, asked a graduate student over a summer to, go create machine vision. And his poor graduate student, because it turned out that problem was so much more complicated than anybody had thought, because they really didn't realize computationally everything that's involved, like just knowing that my head is separate from the wall behind me, for example, or there's just so many. So trying to create artificially intelligent programs was very illuminating, and so was all the research coming from ethology and behavioral ecology, because another way you can see that there's something to be explained is to see how different other species are, right? Dung flies and humans both respond to dung, but our responses are completely different to it. The same stimulus in the environment, but we're repelled. The dung fly is attracted, lays eggs, looks for mates, it raises offspring. The environment does not uniquely determine responses, you need to understand the programs that are processing that environment too. So we were trying to I think sympathetically say what the assumptions of this blank slate view of the human mind was, why people had it, and also the kind of almost conspiracy that existed between psychology and anthropology. Because anthropologists thought, well, the psychologists, they already know that the mind is a blank slate, that is a domain general. It depends on what your framework is, like either a behaviorist framework, a stimulus response machine, or a domain general computational device. The psychologists already know that, and which they didn't. I mean, they assumed it, but they didn't know it. And this anthropologists were thinking, oh well, they're understanding the general laws of learning, and we're understanding the inputs from different cultures that create cultural differences. And the psychologists were thinking, the anthropologists, they know everything about how these different cultural things work, and each one thought that the other one knew things that the other didn't really know. And there had been this tradition since Durkheim in anthropology and the social sciences of keeping them separate from psychology. It was considered a no-no. That's a sin of psychologism. So there was this notion that social facts should only be explained with other social facts, with no reference to psychology, which makes sense if you think that one thing cannot explain something variable. So if you think, well, a universal human nature is not going to explain all this variation, and you think that there's not anything interesting that human nature is adding to the environment that you're experiencing, it's not an unreasonable position, right? So we had to address all of that first, right? Because otherwise it would have been impossible to explain not only why this other view is different, but why it's necessary and why it would be helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So, and just for people to understand it a little bit better, so there's this notion of the evolutionary environment of adaptedness. So, and now and then people say, oh, because we evolved in the savannah, and the problems we had to face there, that's the reason why we have these evolved cognitive modules and so on. But it's not really that, right? It's kind of a composite of all the environments human beings were exposed to while they were evolving, right?
Right. The environment of evolutionary adaptedness is, and there's a different one for different features of an organism. It's the statistical composite of selection pressures that drove the alleles behind a given trait to fixation over time. And so the environment of evolutionary adaptedness for the visual system, it extends back in time much farther than, say, the environment of evolutionary adaptedness for male parental investment in offspring, which is maybe 2 million years old. For something like color constancy. Color constancy is the fact that when you look at the grass outside, you see it as green, and you see it at green at noon when it's bathed in sunlight that's more in the middle ranges. Sunlight's not red to blue, but long wavelength to short wavelength. So it's bathed in the middle wavelengths that we see as green at noon, but at sunset it also looks green. But then it's bathed in long wavelength red light, but we still see it as green. That's an amazing thing that our brains do. That people call color constancy. Adaptations for color constancy have a really long time depth, and the properties of sunlight are part of that environment of evolutionary adaptedness for that system. So, and it breaks down when we go into places illuminated by a different spectrum. So if you go into the parking lot at night, usually there's either sodium vapor or mercury vapor lamps in parking lots. all of a sudden you can't tell what color your car is. They all look sort of muddy brown. When your red car looks muddy brown, that's a breakdown of color constancy. That means it's not working, and it's not working because it wasn't designed to work. Those mechanisms were not designed to work in an environment with those properties of that spectrum. It was designed for the spectrum created by variations in sunlight from our sun over the day. Something like men investing, feeding, hunting, and investing in their children. That's, you don't see that in all primates. That's a very characteristic human adaptation. The time depth for that is so much shorter than that for color constancy. So the environment of evolutionary adaptedness for male parental investment is different than for color constancy, and it's longer, and it's a different set of selection pressures. It's always about the selection pressures. It's not the environment of evolutionary adaptedness is not a given place or time. It's a statistical composite of selection pressures relevant to the design of an adaptation. That doesn't mean that it's not incredibly useful to be studying hunter-gatherer life, to understand the context in which various problems of social behavior occurred, because the world we live in, it's like living under sodium vapor lamps. I mean, from a social point of view, it's so strange. The number of people that you see in a given day, the built environment around us, it's so different in so many ways than small group living, where you know pretty much everybody that you're interacting with, and you're interacting with them repeatedly. It's so understanding small-scale societies is incredibly useful as well. But you don't want to say, oh, the environment of evolutionary adaptedness is, how Kung people live in Botswana, or it is how, Pacific North Coast indigenous people did in their salmon runs in the Pacific Northwest, where they lived in great concentration and were more sedentary. That you don't want to say that, but you want to. Well, you see what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. Yes, it's not a place or time.
Yeah. So,
but can I just say it's actually essential in all areas of evolutionary biology. This is not a concept that's particular to evolutionary psychology, or it ought not to be. Because no matter what organism you're talking about, its adaptations were driven by a particular set of selection pressures. And understanding those selection pressures is part of understanding why the mechanism, whether you're talking about a frog or a gazelle or an ant, why it has those adaptations with that design rather than other ones. And it's often not, I think any evolutionary biologist, if you put it that way, would agree with it, but it's not as key a problem in their thinking to keep these things, these concepts, like the modern environment versus these ancestral environments, distinct, as it is for people studying humans, because we are living so far outside, in some ways and not other ways, so far outside the envelope of conditions is selected for the design of our mechanisms. Biologists are often studying species that are living in environments that are very similar to the ones that selected for their design. And so they don't necessarily, they can get into problems by not distinguishing these things, but they don't trip over it every time they study something in the same way that you will if you're studying humans.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so our phenotype, so the entirety of our characteristics, the entirety of our traits, including the psychological ones, can be the result of and now to focus on the psychological ones, can be the result of directly of adaptations. They can also be byproducts of something else.
Yes.
So, and now and then they can also be the result of some sort of noise, like genetic drifts and things like that. So could you talk about that?
Yes. This was one of the things that George Williams in Adaptation and Natural Selection was very, very clear about. The difference between byproducts of adaptations and adaptations. And then about 12 years later, Stephen Jay Gould wrote The Spandrels of San Marcos, where basically he's talking about byproducts of adaptations. So lots of people call byproducts spandrels, but it was analyzed beautifully more than a decade earlier by Williams. And every adaptation has byproducts. Not only that, well, okay, let me give an example first, and then say what I was going to say. The function of red blood cells is to deliver oxygen to tissues. And to deliver hemoglobin has an iron molecule in it because that's necessary for delivering oxygen to tissues. That's an adaptation. It's there because it performed a function that promoted the survival and reproduction of our ancestors. Now, to the human visual system, things with iron in them look red. So blood looks red to us. We see it as red. The fact that it's red is a byproduct of the fact that the fact that hemoglobin was designed to carry oxygen to tissues and it has iron in it. It's not itself an adaptation. There could be other adaptations that use the fact that blood looks red to us in their design, but just the redness of the blood is a byproduct of an adaptation. It's carried along by the nature of that adaptation. It's a concomitant, it's a side effect. The whiteness of our bones have to be made of something stiff enough to hold us up, and in our case that's calcium, and that looks to our visual system white. But the whiteness of bones is a byproduct. I have a hand with 5 fingers, and it's got a opposable thumb, and it's made well for grasping certain things. It also has a prime number of digits. Who cares? That's a byproduct of its design that this is a prime number. I have 2 eyes because if I were a small rodent avoiding predatory birds, they'd be up here to watch for the birds. Instead, they're in front, giving me depth perception, which if you're a primate going through trees is incredibly important, and important given how we evolved afterwards. But the fact that they're in front is an adaptation that is there to solve particular problems that have to do with depth perception. The fact that 2 is a prime number, again, who cares? Describing it that way doesn't capture the parts that are important for understanding the functional design. Okay. So if you think about it, Gould says, well, there's going to be spandrels. Of course there's going to be spandrels. There's actually an infinite number of spandrels, an infinite number for any species, because I can always carve up an organism into parts in ways that do not capture its functional design. I can carve anything up in ways that don't capture anything functional about it. And every time I do that, I'm defining something. It's the things that I'm defining as parts. So every machine is made of parts. I can either divide up a machine in terms of parts as defined by what problems they solve, or I can divide it into parts in some way that's random with respect to the problems that they solve. Those will all be spandrels. So if you want to test whether something's a spandrel or a byproduct, you have to say what it's a byproduct of, right? And then test that. So it's not good enough to say that there's spandrels. Because there's an infinite number. There's not an infinite number of ways of describing an organism that capture its functional design, that capture the parts that are there because they solve an adaptive problem. And to show that something's an adaptation, you want to show that something's well designed for solving a particular problem, and not just any problem, but a problem that would have impacted survival and reproduction ancestrally. So an analogy is if you're, let's say you're an archaeologist from the future and you're coming back to now, and you're digging up, Santa Barbara, and you find something that looks like a machine, a human-made artifact, and then you and your colleague are arguing about what it is. Right? And you say it's an ancient TV that you've read in the scriptures about these ancient TVs. See, your colleague says it's a stove. How would you decide that? You would decide it by seeing whether that object had features, that artifact, that tool had features that are well designed for cooking food or for showing, taking electromagnetic radiation and transforming it into a color bitmap. If it's a TV, it should have a big screen. It should be capable of transducing electromagnetic radiation into this bitmap of color. It should have features like that. It won't be very good at, frying an egg. If it's a stove, it's going to have elements that really put a lot of heat and that are capable of cooking food and so forth. It probably won't have a big screen. It might have a little thing for controls. And that's how you would decide what that structure, what that tool was for. You can think of an organism as composed of tools, as composed of mechanisms that are there because they solved a problem, just as the tools that we make are there to solve a problem. We design them to solve a problem. And if you want to argue that some aspect of a phenotype is an adaptation, the kind of evidence that you use is just like what the archaeologists use to decide about what that ancient tool was. You're looking for evidence that it's very well designed for solving a particular problem, and that its features are not better designed as a byproduct of a mechanism designed to solve some other problem or some larger class of problems. And so you're using evidence of good design. It's an engineering standard of whether something's an adaptation or not. And this is one of the things that George Williams made extremely clear in that 1966 book, Adaptation and Natural Selection. And saying that something's a byproduct, you also need to show that it's a byproduct of something that was designed for solving a problem, right? Drift will not create design, right? It introduces noise or randomness into a phenotype, or just random genetic variation can inject noise into a phenotype. Like when you're sitting in bed in the morning and thinking about getting up and the sunlight's coming through and you see like little floaty things, on your eye, floaters. There's little random epithelial cells that have just broken off and they're floating around. That's noise. It's there. The fact that they're there is a byproduct of the way your eye is designed, and the fact that there's a big one here and a small one there, that's just random variation. So whenever you're talking about an organism, there's always this question, is the part of the organism I'm talking about, is it an adaptation? Is it there because it was designed by the causal process of natural selection? Is it a byproduct of an adaptation? Or is it just a random occurrence, noise in the system?
Yeah, and perhaps this is a controversial example, but couldn't we think about religion in those terms? So, for example, we have some mental modules that are adaptations, like, for example, the hyperactive agency detection device, theory of mind,
yes.
I mean folk physics, folk biology, and all
yes.
of those things. So, couldn't we think about religion as being a byproduct of all
yes.
these modules combined together?
Yes, this is an argument made by Pascal Boyer, for example, and Scott Atran. Pascal Boyer's book, Religion Explained, it's a play on Dennett's Consciousness Explained, but Religion Explained, the evolutionary origins of religious thought, he's proposing exactly that you have these adaptations that were designed for making inferences about important domains of human activity, like making inferences about other people's behavior. I mean, our theory of mind system, what people call the theory of mind system, is a cognitive system that gives us a folk psychology where we explain behavior as being produced by people's beliefs and their desires and intentions. This is actually, I could say, this is one of the roadblocks to psychology. is we have an evolved mechanism that gives us explanations of human behavior. It's designed to give us explanations of human behavior. Why is somebody doing something? Why are they going to the water fountain? Because they want water and they believe there's water at the fountain. How do they learn things? Well, they figure it out. Okay, yeah, but I mean, the fact that we have these explanations that are part of our evolved design does not, it can blind you to the fact that even that is caused by complicated computational mechanisms which can be broken. Sometimes you see this when you see developmental disorders. So when you see, the famous work was by Simon Baron-Cohen and Alan Leslie and Udo Frith on autism as a specific impairment of your ability to understand that other people can have beliefs. So the fact that we have a theory of mind mechanism was in some sense for many years an impediment to the development of psychology because it seemed like there's nothing to explain. We already understand human behavior, right? People do things because of their beliefs and desires. Full stop, that's it. So anyway, Pascal Boyer's argument is you have all these mechanisms, the intuitive physics, you've got intuitive biology, theory of mind, and that they are powerful inference engines. They structure the kinds of inferences that you make about different domains. And we also have, and this is something that it's not clear to what extent other species have this, we have machinery for meta-representations, for having representations not only, first of all, about representations in other people's heads. So I can have a mental representation about what you're thinking, about some belief that you might have. And Alan Leslie pointed out that the ability to do this requires some very powerful cognitive machinery, because I have to, in order for me to think about what you might be thinking, I have to hold that, my representation of what you're thinking, separate from my encyclopedia of knowledge about the world, because it might be wrong. You might have a false belief. You might think that it's raining outside, and I might know it's not raining outside. But your belief that it's raining outside will cause you to take an umbrella and so forth. But it's important that that understanding be held separate from everything else I know, or else there's going to be a problem of data corruption. My entire data bank of information is going to get corrupted by putting information that's false in there. Well, the thing about that is that ability to hold meta-representations and keep them decoupled, people call it decoupled from your other knowledge about the world, also allows counterfactual thinking. It allows us to suppose things. So it allows us to hold representations tentatively and then make inferences about, like, what if I went to Disneyland today? And then I can make inferences about what if I went to Disneyland today, without becoming delusional and thinking I actually went to Disneyland today. And this underlies science. It underlies all kinds of very powerful things that humans do that are very different than a lot of other species. And it's been argued, like Dan Sperber has argued, that it's crucial for human pedagogy. His beautiful example is, let's say you're 3 years old and you hear your teacher says that there are male and female trees, male and female plants. And you're 3, and your notion of female and male is like has long hair, has short hair, or something like this. This will be a very puzzling statement, because how can plants don't even have hair. So what does it mean to say that there's male and female plants? And so his notion is that when you hear something that you don't understand, you hold it provisionally in a meta-representation. My teacher says that there are male and female plants. It's not retired to your encyclopedia of knowledge. Instead, it recruits attention. It's very memorable. It recruits attention. You have a desire to ask other people about it, and so forth, until you can reconcile it with everything else you know, at which point you put it in your data bank and you lose the source tag. So you store that there's male and female plants, but you don't remember who taught that to you anymore. So what Boyer is arguing about religious ideas, this kind of spontaneous religious ideas, supernatural ideas that people across cultures have, is that they have two big properties. One is that they activate one of these evolved inference engines, like the theory of mind mechanism. And the other one is that they violate the assumptions of another one. So ghosts are a great example. A ghost is a dead person who can walk through walls, of course. Okay. Now, that's a very, very contagious idea. It spreads easily from mind to mind because think about it. It's a kind of person. When I tell you the ghost is a dead person, by telling you it's a kind of person, I'm telling you that ghosts have beliefs and desires and feelings, that they can see things and hear things. All those inferences come for free by virtue of my categorizing a ghost as a kind of person. On the other hand, I've also just violated assumptions of two other evolved inference systems. One is, if somebody's dead, how are they walking around? If our intuitive biology defines dead as the permanent cessation of the ability to act, which it looks like that's how the mind spontaneously defines death, then how is somebody walking around when they're dead? It violates one of a fundamental notion of the difference between being alive and dead. And even more than that, it violates the notion that two solid objects can't pass through one another. I just told you it's a dead person who's walking through walls. How is a person walking through walls? When you're 2 months old, and probably before, a lot of research in cognitive development has shown that as early as 2 months, it's hard to test the babies on this before 2 months, but babies know that two solid objects can't pass through one another. And if you show them something where a magic display where it looks like that they have, the baby's very surprised. So it's one of our most fundamental assumptions about the world is if two physical objects can't pass through one another. And I've just violated that by telling you that ghosts are dead people who walk through walls. So the idea is that you can't just retire this idea to your encyclopedia of knowledge and be done with it, that it's going to be put in a meta-representation. You know, somebody said that ghosts are dead people who walk through walls, and it's going to recruit a lot of attention in the same way that my teacher says that there are male and female plants, because it can't be reconciled with your other assumptions about the world. But in this case, it can't be reconciled with assumptions that are so deep and so part of your the evolved architecture of your mind that they will never be reconciled with the rest of your knowledge. But this makes these ideas memorable. They recruit a lot of attention. You have this impulse to tell people, hey, did you know that Ricardo told me that there's ghosts, and that ghosts are dead people who walk through walls? What do you think about that? And so the idea is that they either stay as meta-representations and become just facts about the world, like some people think there's ghosts, there's entities with these properties, or you abandon them as in the same way that you might abandon a false belief. Like if I realize that you think it's raining and I know it's not raining. And so that's the core of his argument, that by tying into an evolved inference engine like our theory of mind mechanism, it supports lots of interesting inferences about ghosts. You can imagine their social interactions and what they'll do if they see you doing something they think is wrong, and so forth. So it supports lots of inferences while still recruiting attention because it violates these other very fundamental inference engines that drive how we think about the world. So yes, from that, he's argued that supernatural ideas are byproducts of the way our mind is dissolved. Both of those, not dissolved, designed. Both of those core inference systems and of this ability to form meta-representations, to have decoupled representations that let us think counterfactually and understand that other people can have beliefs that are false and even compute what those might be, and so on. So a byproduct of both of those things in that view, right?
Yeah, and earlier you were talking about, you were giving an example, so if people in the future, archaeologists are doing an excavation and they find a particular piece of technology and they start wondering, oh, why did people use this, for what, and so on. But I think that in the future, they will in fact have an artifact that they won't be able to explain through science, but they will have to recur to metaphysics or something like that. That is, when they are doing an excavation and they find Trump's hair.
And they find what? Trump's hair. Probably.
Yeah, they will have.
That is a mystery.
Yeah. So, okay. So, okay, we have already talked a little bit about mental/cognitive modules, but I guess that back in the 80s, 90s, when people started talking about these modules, that many people associated them with the sense Jerry Fodor gave to them, in the sense that they were kind of isolated, encapsulated, they didn't really interact with one another. So,
Yes.
and so do you still use the notion of modules because in a way it was corrupted by this view,
Yes.
or do you use
No.
another kind of
I had to abandon the use of a perfectly good term because Jerry Fodor ruined the term for everybody. I mean, the notion of a module originated differently as it's a mechanism that's very good at solving a particular problem. It didn't involve being isolated from every other mechanism. That's absurd. And in the modularity of mind, it's such a bizarre book in some ways, very good in some ways and very bizarre in other ways. He identified modules almost exclusively with input systems like vision and hearing and language, because, well, let me not psychoanalyze him for a minute, but he was saying that, look, by module, I mean something that has these kinds of properties, and he had a list of 9, which he said none of them are either necessary or sufficient, but some things tend to have these properties, and they were things like being domain specifics, like theory of mind is domain specific, or vision is for figuring out what and where there is given the reflective properties of surfaces and so on. They're fast, they're often fast, and they work automatically outside of conscious perception. And he had a list of 9, only one of which was information encapsulation. Information encapsulation being the idea that other kinds of information, especially beliefs, don't penetrate into the inner workings of that mechanism. And so then he says that the rest of the mind, so-called central processes like reasoning and thinking of various kinds, is non-modular. And he says, and that's all a mystery. And we'll never have a decent cognitive science of that. But the input systems are modular. And he says, and I want them to be. Go back and look at it. He says, and I want them to be because I hate relativism, he says. He says, I hate it the same way I hate, not plastic boats, what is it? Fiberglass sailboats instead of wooden ones. It's a very strange argument. And he's talking about certain views of perception where he wants there to think that there's perceptual systems where what you see, it's not being affected by beliefs that you might have about the world. He wants it to be that you're seeing the world as it is, which is a sort of an odd thing for a cognitive scientist to say, because obviously the visual system is imposing concepts on the world. The world has properties, but the particular way we see objects and so forth is a construction of the mind, or what Roger Shepard used to call an externally driven hallucination. But he says, he says, information encapsulation is the most important thing, because that allows us to see the world and hear things the way they really are, and not in a way that's biased by our beliefs. And so in part 1 of the book, that's just one of 9 criteria that are neither necessary nor sufficient to call something a module. And then the other part of the book, it's the most important thing. And also none of his 9 criteria it's an adaptation. It's designed by natural selection to solve a particular adaptive problem. For reasons that I don't exactly understand, he hated the notion of evolutionary functionalism. But so when I was doing research early on about reasoning mechanisms. So God forbid I'm in the realm of reasoning and so-called central processes, reasoning mechanisms that are specialized for social exchange, and a subroutine that seems to be specialized for detecting cheaters in social exchange, individuals who take the benefit offered to them by another person without meeting that other person's requirement, and doing so intentionally, not by accident. People would say, why are you calling it a module? What is your evidence for information encapsulation? Jerry Fodor says there has to be information encapsulation. And I would say, that's one of 9 criteria that are neither necessary nor sufficient. And why would this be encapsulated? Things that I know about my history of interaction with a person or their character and so forth, that should feed into a mechanism that focuses my attention on looking for potential cheaters. And they say, no, it can't be a module then. What are you talking about? And I had to give up this word because it was causing confusion instead of clarity. None of which would have happened if he hadn't been hugely influential and constructed his book in this very peculiar way. So a lot of times I'll just talk about adaptations or computational adaptations or adaptive specializations, because that at least gets at the core notion of function, that a mechanism is there to solve a particular adaptive problem. And to do it, it often has to be domain specific. It often has to have inference procedures that are specialized for that particular domain of interaction, so like theory of mind does for understanding people's behavior, and so on. So yes, it would be very convenient to use the term, but
Yeah.
I can't use it anymore. Maybe someday these other meanings will go away sufficiently that people can use it again. Some of my colleagues still use it, but they try to explain this is what I mean by it, and not these other things. And
it's kind of hard to have to go through the entire explanation just to use a term, right? But
exactly, exactly.
Okay, and just another thing for people to understand it a bit better. So, in one of your papers, I don't have the title here with me, but you talk about the mind or these adaptations as evolved crib sheet. So that you say that in a sense, when we're born, or we already have these innate mechanisms that know the problems we're going to deal with, and already have some sort of information about how to deal with them, right?
Yes. In the United States, a crib sheet is if you're taking an exam and you're cheating on the exam and you've written the answers on a piece of paper. That's the crib sheet. It has answers already. The idea is that these mechanisms, these adaptations themselves, are supplying answers to supplying information about many aspects of the world. Like nobody has to tell me that you have thoughts, that you have mental representations, that you have desires, beliefs, intentions. My mind assumes that automatically by virtue of having classified you as a human and an agent. The same for many other domains. You could have, so in reasoning about social exchange, there are lots of inferences that we make spontaneously. Like if I say, so you can actually, one of our former graduate students, professor of anthropology now, Larry Sugiyama, he was traveling in Peru, and he, with Yora people who speak Yora. And Larry he spoke Spanish, but not Yora. And he wanted to make a trade. And he had a knife, and the other guy had chickens. And so Larry was able to say, 1 knife, 2 chickens. And the guy agrees, but then he starts to give Larry 1 chicken. And Larry says, no, 1 knife, 2 chickens. And then they trade. But think about it. That's such a impoverished communication, right? 1 knife, 2 chickens. But they understand everything from that. each person understands that if I give him the knife, then he's obligated to give me 2 chickens. If he doesn't give me 2 chickens, I'm not obligated to give him the knife. If I give him the knife, I'm entitled to 2 chickens, not 1 chicken. That if he doesn't give me the 2 chickens after agreeing to this, then he will have cheated me, etc. And the other guy will understand that Larry, if he doesn't give him the knife, but he takes the chickens, will have cheated him. And they all understand the set of mutual obligations and entitlements that are implicit in saying 1 knife, 2 chickens, and agreeing to that, even though, because their social exchange algorithms are supplying all those inferences for free. And those inferences don't come naturally out of any domain general first order logic, for example. They aren't the same inferences that if all you had in your head was a little module that did nothing but apply rules from logic, like modus ponens and modus tollens. Modus tollens is if I say, if P then Q is true, P is true, therefore Q is true. That would be modus ponens. If we only had a little module that did that, and that was our only inference system, you wouldn't make those same inferences. You would make different inferences. So those inferences are supplied by some specialized machinery. And that allows us to engage in this crazy thing of exchange, which is so hypertrophied in humans. I mean, that you find reciprocation in various other species, but the extent to which we engage in exchange for any number of different goods and services, an unlimited array of goods and services, is something very peculiar to our species and kind of amazing. But yes, supplying those inferences is what I mean by that would be part of the evolved crib sheet. Larry and the Yora guy he was exchanging with, they both had the same crib sheet. And so they both understood the interaction completely.
Yeah, and another thing, and this is one of the points related to evolutionary psychology, where people most usually disconnect from things and get angry about the explanations that are behind
what? Angry?
Sorry?
What? People get angry? No, I'm just kidding.
No,
yes,
no, no, yes,
of course.
That never happens. Never. But I mean, the distinction between ultimate and proximate explanations, yes. Because this is one of the points where people usually get angry about, so you do that because you want to reproduce. Oh no, I don't want to reproduce, I just want to whatever.
Yes.
Right.
No, I know. Yes. And the ultimate explanation is the problem that the mechanism was designed to solve, the selection pressures that led to its design. The mechanism itself, let me use, since it's Mother's Day, let me use the example of maternal love. You can get technical about maternal love. You can talk about an attachment system. You can talk about a motivational system that causes you to want to keep your offspring close to you, to feed them, to make sure they're healthy, to protect them from predators, to protect them from other people, to help them engage with the world. You don't love your children to spread your genes. You don't have a desire to spread your genes. There's no mental representation of genes. Genes is a modern concept that it's like, a little over 100 years old. There is no motivation to spread your genes. There is a motivational system that has the effect of causing you to want to take care of your offspring and see them flourish. And it has many very specific properties to it. Our ancestors, those who had that system, that I'll call that motivational system maternal love, had more offspring than mothers whose motivational systems caused them to neglect their offspring. So you have selection for alternative designs. The selection for maternal neglect got outcompeted by selection for maternal love. That's because that's how natural selection works. design features, features of our phenotype, whether it's a cognitive mechanism or whether it's fingers or elbows or knees, they have effects on their own reproduction in a population. And those that promote their own reproduction relative to alternative designs are the ones that spread, and those are the ones that become universal and species typical. So I don't love my daughter because I want to spread my genes. Right? That's the wrong way to think about it. And it's a wrong way to think about it. Actually, also, it's the wrong way to think about it when you're thinking about the gene as a unit of selection. Because whatever genes participate in creating that motivational system, they promoted their own reproduction because of the effects on survival of offspring. And it doesn't matter that I also have genes for knees and genes for eyes. The genes underlying other parts of my phenotype are irrelevant to it. In fact, there are cases, well, it's not that I'm trying to spread my genome, my whole set of genes. My whole set of genes is irrelevant. I never spread my whole set of genes because I don't clone. I'm not an asexual organism. A random half of my genes were randomly chosen as gametes were formed, and they were jammed together with a random set of John's genes to produce our daughter. My genome is not replicated. Particular chromosomes went into, from me and from him, went into making her, but the genome is not, it's like there is no motivation to spread your genome. There's no motivation to spread your genes per se. Does my eye have a motivation to spread its genes? No. My eye has the features that it does. Does my cornea? Does the pupil? All of those features are there because those features promoted their own reproduction better than alternative features. And that's true for every single component of our species typical design, all of it, not just behavior. So the proximate mechanism refers to the actual adaptation. The ultimate explanation has to do with why it's there, why it was selected. And this is actually, we were talking about sociobiology versus evolutionary psychology. In sociobiology, people were so excited about these theories of selection pressures, especially about social behavior, that some people got a little bit confused, in my opinion, about the ultimate proximate distinction. They would valorize ultimate explanations and sort of denigrate proximate explanations. But if you think about it, Darwin's theory is a theory of phenotypes. It's a theory about why do organisms have the properties that they do. Why do the finches have beaks, different beaks on the different islands of the Galapagos? You're trying to understand why there are some proximate mechanisms rather than others, why there's some adaptations rather than others. And theories about selection pressures are theories about that. So if there is no Darwinism without adaptations, because that's what natural selection is an explanation of. Adaptations are the thing to be explained. They're the explanandum. Natural selection is the explanation of adaptation. So you can't have a truly Darwinian theory of humans or any other organism without reference to adaptations. And so that's one of the reasons you can't just go from selection pressures to behavior. There are adaptations that were selected for because they produce some kinds of behaviors rather than other behaviors. And you're missing that crucial level of explanation if you ignore the adaptation. So, yes, it's not to spread your, it's not just, so people would sometimes, and you can sometimes see this, occasionally you could even see this with evolutionary biologists. And I think it's because our theory of mind mechanism is so powerful that we think of behavior as caused by beliefs and desires. It's just like in economics, they use that folk theory and they say, well, you have beliefs about how the world is, and then you have a desire to make money, and that explains why you make the choices that you do. I mean, I'm saying very, very kernel. Economics is a very elegant science. I'm not disputing that, but that's kind of the folk theory that economists work from, even though it's not part of their axiomatized theory. Some evolutionary biologists who just inserted into that desire slot about what you want, instead of money, instead of maximizing payoffs in terms of money, they substituted maximizing fitness or maximizing number of offspring. But that's a very blank slate view. It's the view of the mind as a general purpose information processing device where it has a goal, maximize number of offspring, and it'll figure out, no matter what circumstance it's in, what course of action will produce the most offspring. That's an incorrect view, I would argue, of the human mind. And not just incorrect, it's impossible. It's computationally impossible. You can't make a computational device that will do that. It would require parallel lives, evaluating different universes, evaluating alternative courses of action in all their combinations to figure out what's most likely to produce the most offspring. It's using a criterion that's in the far future to decide what I'm doing. So it can lead you to ask what I view as kooky questions if you make that mistake. So you might ask questions like, or you might propose explanations of, you might say, oh, well, there were celibate monks in monasteries. Why? Oh, maybe even though they're celibate, maybe they're actually maximizing their reproductive success or their inclusive fitness because they're helping their siblings. And that's why they're monks. Maybe they're helping their siblings, maybe they're not helping their siblings, but that's not an explanation for being a monk, right? That's based on the theory that your mind is that you have this desire to maximize number of offspring, and whatever situation you're in, that must be the explanation of whatever you do. It's to maximize the number of offspring. From that point of view, you would also be puzzled by why are men not lined up around the block at sperm banks, ready to make deposits at sperm banks? Why are people ever using contraception? It makes no sense. If that's how you think the mind works, none of those things make sense. On the other hand, if you think, okay, we have mechanisms that make us enjoy sex, like other organisms do, and we have those mechanisms because they had the consequence of producing offspring better than mechanisms that would make you hate to have sex. And that's why we have those mechanisms. But you don't have sex. You have sex because you enjoy the sex. I mean, because of the adaptations you have, not because you're trying to have the maximum number of your genes in your genome be in the next generation. I don't know if I'm saying this correctly, but there's the two errors: the not understanding the proximate mechanism that's being designed by natural selection, and treating the genome as a whole as opposed to that a gene solves problems that promote its own reproduction. There are cases where your genome doesn't all agree, by the way. So for example, there are the mosquitoes that carry yellow fever. The males have a mutation called the driving Y chromosome. And the driving Y chromosome, normally the Y chromosome puts itself into half of the sperm. The driving Y, it's a segregation distorter. Instead of putting itself into half of the sperm, it puts itself into all sperm. That means that any male with that driving Y has only sons. And since their sons have inherited the driving Y chromosome, they have only sons. And their sons have only sons until the whole population becomes male and it collapses. Okay? Now, that driving Y chromosome, it promotes its own reproduction. It's not necessarily doing anything that's beneficial for the other genes in the mosquito, the genes that code for other aspects of the mosquito's phenotype. It's something that promotes its own reproduction, even though that's doesn't help at all the other genes in the genome. Our mitochondrial genes are that way. They come. You're a dead end for your mother's mitochondrial genes. Every son is a dead end for the mitochondrial genes or any extranuclear gene because he's not going to pass them on. Only daughters pass on the mitochondrial genes. That means that if you're going to have a mutation that changes the sex ratio, if it's in a cytoplasmic gene, an extranuclear gene, it's going to promote its reproduction best if it codes for daughters. But that's not necessarily good for the nuclear genes. Nuclear genes are not spread only by daughters; they're spread by daughters and sons. And so you can find cases of conflict within the genome in various species, where, like you can find this in certain species of corn, where you have cytoplasmically inherited genes that are causing only daughters to be produced, and then there'll be a mutation on the nuclear part of the genome that suppresses that and produces sons again, and then there'll be a counter mutation on the and it's wildly swinging sex ratios, and so we barely hang together. So yes, that's why all of that is why you have to keep the ultimate approximate explanations completely separate. And you're right, that is one thing where people get confused about that, and it makes them very angry. My father got very angry when I first started to learn this stuff. My father, I came home from college with my sophomore year, and I had the selfish gene. And I was trying to tell my parents about sociobiology and the gene is a unit of selection. And my father looks at me and he says, I think he may have even picked up the book. I can't remember if he threw across the room or if that's just an elaboration that my imagination has. But he says, I don't give a damn about my genes. And I said, what do you mean? He said, if somebody told me tomorrow that you're not my biological daughter, I would still love you just as much. I don't give a damn about my genes. I thought he was being unreasonable at the time, but actually, he was correct. He doesn't love me because I carry his genes. He has paternal love because of an ancestral process that selected for maternal love because of its effect on the replication of genes for paternal love. So my dad was correct when he said that. But it was a common way that people misinterpreted what all of this is about.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that one of the main reasons why people look at the explanations that come from evolutionary psychology and then say, oh, they are just so stories, right? Is because, most of the things that go around in our mind are subconscious, right? And most of the things that influence our behavior and our decisions operate at the subconscious level. And so even now and then when I have discussions with people about these things and we're talking about, men usually on average choose women that have these characteristics and men that have those characteristics and so on. All the time someone comes and says something like, oh, so you're saying that because that all men choose women because they have neotenous facial traits and waist-width ratio of 0.7 and clear skin and so on. And I have to be honest, sometimes I troll them a bit and say, oh, that really... you're talking about the case of your cousin Bob, who's married to a woman with square chin, large shoulders, big belly, and burps all the time. But my great-grandmother only ate potatoes and beans, but because she didn't have access to cake and steak. So perhaps if your cousin Bob was higher on the hierarchy, on the male hierarchy, perhaps he could try a shot at Jennifer Lawrence or something.
You are trolling them.
I'm trolling you.
Yeah. No, it's you know, actually, yes, most of what goes on in your mind is not even capable of becoming conscious. But you know, one of my students said about just so stories and adaptationism is yes, an adaptationist explanation is just so. It's good. It's just so. It's an expression in English. Something's just so when it's just perfect. But a just so story is another word for an explanation. Science is supposed to provide explanations. I could say, look, why? I could look. I know pens drop when I let them go. Isaac Newton knew that apples would fall from the tree. What's this universal theory of gravitation? That's a just so story for something we already all know. We all know that things drop. Right? Yes, it's called an explanation. Theories provide explanations for phenomena. It's like people, often in psychology, people will say, some people will say, well, I don't want to know something if my grandmother could have told it to me. No, I want to study something if my grandmother could have told it to me. If there's something that's so common and so universal and so frequent as a kind of behavior that even your grandmother knew, probably there are really interesting, complex adaptations that are giving rise to that behavior. You know, you don't want to just study the things that are unpredicted or strange. So obviously, it's always fine to go from some description of the phenotype, like an eyeball, and try to understand why it was designed the way it is, have an evolutionary explanation for its design. That's always okay. That's what people usually mean when they say a just so story. You're taking a mechanism that already is known to exist and trying to understand it. But you can also, what we've done is usually go in the opposite direction, is take theories about problems, ancestral adaptive problems, and use them to develop hypotheses about things that nobody knows exists. So, I mean, it can't be a post hoc explanation if nobody knew the thing existed before. And I would say that even if you know everything about how a mechanism works, you are still not understanding fundamental things about it if you don't know what it's for. Can I show you? It'll take me a minute to just get it out of my bag. Can I show you something? I want to show you an example. Okay. So lots of times, a lot of psychologists, neuroscientists say this a lot. You know, they'll say, well, if I know about the dopamine receptors and the serotonin receptors, if I know these things, why do I need to know anything about what the mechanism is for? Okay, see this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. I claim that you see everything about how this mechanism works pretty much. You looking at it? Where do I hold to? Okay. It's not hard to see the mechanism. What's it for?
Yeah, what's it for? Well, I'm not sure, but perhaps to grab something that is of the same diameter as...
Yes, but to what end?
Oh, to what end? Yeah.
Yes. Why does this exist? Why did somebody go to the trouble of manufacturing this? Okay, here's things that it's not for. It's not for making carrots have ridges on them. It's a wrong diameter. It's not for pulling corks out of bottles. Again, the diameter is wrong. It's not, my students always think it's some strange sexual device. It's not that. That would be painful. If I tell you, the question is, if I tell you what this is for, tell me if you then understand more about it. This is, you know how some people eat soft-boiled eggs? They put it in a cup, the soft-boiled egg, and then you want to take the top off the soft-boiled egg so that you can eat it with a spoon. That's what this is for. This is to put on the top of the chicken egg, not an ostrich egg shell, not a quail egg shell, a chicken egg, and to pull off that top so you could eat the soft-boiled egg inside. Now, when you know that, you know why it's circular. You know why it has this particular diameter, not others. You know why these are sharp. You know why these are they're only about a quarter of an inch, like a half centimeter, maybe less. Well, about a half centimeter long, because it only needs to go through the shell. It doesn't need to go farther than the shell. You know why it has things for the fingers. That you probably knew from your experience of scissors. You also know why it's made of metal, because it needs to be hard enough to go through the shell. You also know that the fact that the metal is silver is a byproduct of its design. It's not crucial to its design. It could be painted any color and it would still accomplish that function. You know about the design, why this is like this is. I would claim that even though you knew every single part of this before I told you what it was for, that you have a richer, deeper understanding of it now that you know what it's for, because you understand why each part is there and which parts are crucial to its design and which parts are not. And I think that's true for any part of an organism's phenotype, or a collection of mechanisms like this. And for any one of them, even if you know everything about how it works, which you probably don't for any of them, but even if you did, there's an added layer of understanding of which parts are there because they solved a problem and which parts are arbitrary that you get when you understand what it's for. And if I told you, hey, wouldn't it be nice to have a little device that takes the top off of soft-boiled eggs really easily? You might well design something like this that has various properties like that. And so if I told you, you know what, amongst all those kitchen implements, I bet you there's one that takes the top off the soft-boiled eggs that has that function, you would probably, seeing all those kitchen implements, pick this one out. You would look for it. You would look for something with these kinds of design features. And that's what evolutionary psychology does for you as a researcher. It tells you that there's likely to be something, a mechanism that solves a particular problem in our brains, and what features it's likely to have, so that you can then conduct experiments to look for them.
Exactly. And so in evolutionary psychology and evolutionary theory in general, we predict variability. So there's variability among individuals, but before that I would like to talk a little bit about cultural variability, because now and then people look at different cultures and they say, oh, but in appearance they have all these tons of differences, but then again, according to evolutionary psychology, people evolved the same cognitive modules because they had to deal with they had to solve identical problems during the evolutionary timeline, but then again, these modules don't determine behavior, so in different environments they can be tuned in different ways, right?
Right. They ought not to produce the same behavior in all environments, because their purpose is to produce different behavior in different environments. Their purpose is to use information to generate behavior in ways that would have been, on average, adaptive under ancestral circumstances. So it would be very strange if people were behaving exactly the same way in all possible circumstances. The mechanisms that you expect to be universal are ones with you can always describe something in ways that capture regularities or in ways that capture differences. So I could say, well, everybody's eyes are different because this person has blue eyes and I have brown eyes, and my daughter has hazel eyes, and look, even among people with hazel eyes, there are speckles here and this eye, and there's not speckles in this eye. Okay, but they're all eyes. They all have the same functional design. There's a cornea in all of them. There's an iris. There's all of these things that are the same across them. And so, to some extent, whether you focus on variability or regularities, it's almost an aesthetic preference. Right? But you don't. But it's not so helpful if you're focusing only on the variability. It's not so helpful because the variability is variability within a universal design. Now, the part that you expect to be universal is the functional design. Like my stomach, the functional design of stomachs is the same, connected, to the esophagus at one end, to the small intestines at the other end, has an acid bath in the middle. But the exact shape of the stomach, it can vary a lot. It doesn't matter. And the exact amount of acid can vary a lot. And it can vary for all kinds of reasons. What you're eating, there can be genetic variation, random variation that affects things like that, and so on. But the complex functional design, anything that's coded for by a suite of genes that have to work together to produce anything with a complex functional design where a suite of genes has to work together to produce the outcome, that you expect the genetic basis for that to be universal. Because otherwise, so if you think about men and women and humans, you have every gene necessary to have ovaries, a uterus, breasts, everything. I mean, I have everything I need to have testes, to have a beard, all of these things, except for the antigen on the Y chromosome. Okay? So the genetic basis for all of those complex adaptations that go into being female versus going into being male, those adaptations, the genetic basis for them is universal. We all have it. What differs is whether that you have a gene that turns on and off a whole suites of other genes that turn you into a male, and I don't have that switch. It needs to be designed that way because imagine that if it was designed differently. Imagine that I had all the genes for having a female reproductive system, and you had all the genes for having a male reproductive system, and then there's sexual recombination where chromosomes are being randomly chosen and put together to produce an offspring. The offspring is not going to have all the parts necessary to be either one or the other. It's going to be some sort of non-functional intermediate form. This is why you find this like in ants and bees, for example, where you have different morphs. So you have queens and workers and soldiers, depending on the species. They look very different and they behave very differently. But they all have the genes for being any one of those things. It depends on what they're fed as larvae. So, queens are fed something called royal jelly, and that turns the larva into a queen. But that queen has all the genes for being a worker or a soldier, and vice versa for the workers and soldiers. That's a complex, all of those three morphs, and they're behavioral and physically different morphologies. The genetic basis for those three morphs is present in all of them. And it's just which genes are turned on or off. Other things are freer to vary. So anything that's a matter of a sort of single gene variation or just a little quantitative variation, that can vary across places in time much more easily. So a really good example of this is, I'm lactose intolerant. And, I'm of Greek descent, and most people on Earth are lactose intolerant. People descended from Northern Europeans are much more tolerant to lactose, milk sugar. We're mammals. We all are able to digest milk as infants because we're mammals. It's a defining feature of mammals that offspring are nursed with milk by their mothers. But for most humans on most parts of the planet, there's not milk available when they're older, right? To have milk available when you're older and to have it with the sugar, you need two things. One is you need to be having animals available, like cows or some goats, something that you can milk. But in most parts of the world where it's not cold enough or there's no refrigeration, the milk sugar, the lactose, is going to be eaten by bacteria. And so in lots of parts of the world, yes, even if they have milk as adults, it's sour milk products like yogurt or cheese. They're sour because the sugar has been eaten by bacteria. So the bacteria are winning, right? Because they're getting a bunch of the energy from that milk. In Northern Europe, people could both keep animals for milk, and it was cold enough that they could have access to the milk and keep it for a while with the milk sugar in it without the bacteria getting it first. So think about the lactase gene, the gene for the enzyme lactase. That's the enzyme that breaks apart the milk sugar. That gene has a very complex design. It's a piece of nanomachinery. It has a very intricate structure to be able to break down milk sugar. We all have the lactase gene, even me. But it's turned on and it's produced, that gene, that the lactase, the enzyme, is produced when we're infants. But in most people, its production is ramped down when they become teenagers or adults because it's now useless. Why would I put metabolic energy into producing an enzyme that is not going to help me? That's not useful because I don't have access to milk anymore. In people in Northern Europe, there were some genetic changes so that enzyme stayed active, so that you kept producing the enzyme into adulthood. That's quantitative variation. So what I'm trying to distinguish is the genetic basis of a complex machine that has many parts and requires the fixation of many different alleles, which would be having the gene for producing the lactase enzyme at all, versus quantitative variation, which can push around something like, well, does it stay active for how long of your life does it stay activated? That can and does vary sometimes from population to population. So sometimes there are little tweaky quantitative genetic changes like that. That's not impossible. The thing that's really not possible, that would be very difficult, would be if some people had the genetic basis for the lactase gene and other people lacked the genetic basis for that gene at all because of sexual recombination, because we reproduce sexually with this weird, random jamming together of two people's genomes. That's the part that's why a lot of people don't understand that when John and I are arguing for the genetic basis of certain complex adaptations being universal, it's not because we think environments were always the same. It's because it's a logical consequence of the fact that we reproduce sexually instead of cloning. Because it's an engineering, it's a feature of the engineering of sexual reproduction that you have to have the genetic basis be common to everybody for the complex functional design, or else it'll get ripped apart.
Yeah, exactly. And I would say that's what people have to have in mind when they think about evolutionary psychology, and to think along those lines, because if you're a stupid person like me who reads an article you wrote some time ago about how men with bigger upper body strength tend to be more supportive of military action, then what I think, oh great, so that means that if I start manifesting myself for all military actions around the world, then I will be able to lure women into believing that's a proxy for my upper body strength, and that I'm not really just a liberal wimp. So, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I should have known better. Yeah. Okay. So another question: how would modules be represented physically? That is to say, would they correspond to neural networks or something like that?
Well, they don't have to be physically localized, so they don't have to be you don't have to have a mechanism can be composed of connections that are in many parts of the brain. Think about, you're probably too young to remember old-fashioned phones, telephones, before they had, chips in them and so forth. But when I was a child, there were telephones that were sort of like boxes, and if you took off the cover, you saw all kinds of wires inside of them. And the wires are hooked up to each other in a particular way so that the telephone works, right? But when you shove it back into that box, a particular connection might be at this part of the box or that part of the box or some other part of the box. And where exactly it is within that box is not so important as how the wires are connected to one another. So yes, there's going to be some neural instantiation of any mechanism, but it doesn't have to be necessarily here versus here. I mean, there may be constraints so that it will be on average like that, but it doesn't have to be physically localized. The connections can be spread out, and also they're going to be, each mechanism is going to be using outputs from lots of other mechanisms. So you're going to see this. So it's not a phrenological claim. It's not a claim about phrenology, okay? We're talking about something that's functionally isolable, whether it's in one particular physical location or another, or more spread out. But when it comes to the physical, how physically a functionally specialized mechanism like cheater detection is represented, I have no idea. That's the sort of thing that a neuroscientist would have to figure out, and they'd have to figure it out. They would only figure that out if they knew that there was such a thing as a cheater detection mechanism. If they don't know that there's a mechanism designed for detecting cheaters, they're never going to look for its physical location or manifestation, right? They may not even trip over it in neuropsychological, in patients with brain damage. They may not trip over it even because they don't know to look for it. They might know that, well, this person had brain damage and they're behaving oddly, but it wouldn't necessarily occur to you that they might be behaving oddly because there's something very specific that's happened to a particular mechanism for detecting cheaters, for example. It's one of these things where to go looking for the physical basis of something, you have to know it exists. And so people know the visual system exists and they look for the physical basis of the visual system. There are certain things they know exist, but a lot of the things that we've been studying, you're not going to look unless somebody said, hey, it looks like there's a mechanism specialized for this. Where is it and how does it work? It became clear to me years and years ago that I ought not to be the person who figures out things about neurons and hormones. I don't think I have any talent at that whatsoever. And so I leave those questions to the people who are much better equipped to answer them, than me. I mean, what a really honest neuroscientist will tell you is that this question about how exactly neurons process information about anything, they don't know exactly. I mean, they know that they do. They know that disrupting their operation will change behavior, but it's one of the how to go from a description, a neural description in terms of receptors and connections between neurons, to a computational description is a bit unclear to everybody at this moment. Hopefully it'll become clearer and clearer over time. But so that's a long way of telling you, I don't know.
Fair enough. So, and now this is sort of a philosophical question, but related to evolutionary psychology. So, if we have these evolved adaptations and they served us to deal with the world outside, let's say. So even if they don't process all the time information in a precisely accurate manner, don't they still refer to something that is true in the sense that it corresponds to something real?
Can you say that again slightly differently? I apologize because as you were talking, I started to worry about something different, and then I lost a key part of what you were saying. You were saying that might a mechanism. Go ahead.
We have these evolved adaptations, right? The modules and things like that. So and they served us in dealing with the world. The world around us. So even if they don't always process information in a precisely accurate manner, don't they still refer to something that we could consider to be true, even if only in the sense of it being real?
You can have selection for mechanisms that represent the world in a way that's not true if it was useful. So, for example, I might, let's say
perhaps just to make it a bit easier, because this comes from an idea that has been somewhat in the media recently, in the YouTube media, let's say recently. I don't know if you know about Brett Weinstein.
I don't know. I don't know if I know. You would have to tell me more.
Okay, that professor that had that issue at Evergreen State University.
Oh, he was the one that was told that he can't come onto campus?
Yes.
Yeah, I know a little bit about that.
Oh, okay. But one of the ideas he has is, and he's an evolutionary biologist, is that we could differentiate between literal truth, that is what we discover through science, let's say, about the world, and then metaphorical truth that he defines as being something that would have been useful, or that can still be useful for us nowadays, that doesn't really correspond to something literally true, but he calls it metaphorical truth.
Well, some would argue, Dan Dennett has argued that the theory of mind mechanism is like that. Dan Dennett's argued that we may represent behavior as caused by beliefs and desires, but there's no such thing in the head that corresponds to a belief and a desire. There's no such that's a convenient way of speaking, but doesn't describe the way that the information processing system really works. I'm agnostic about that particular thing, but that particular example. But that would be an example. So he would say, if you're playing chess with a computer program, it's very useful to think of the computer program as knowing the rules of chess and that it's trying to win. And that'll allow you to predict its moves. But he says, but look, what particular computations are being done by that program, you have no idea what those are. But it's still a very useful way of thinking about the computer program. There may be lots of programs in our heads that are like that. And I don't know if I want to call them metaphorically true or not metaphorically true. But there are a lot of programs in our heads that are going to do things that are super useful. They may not always be useful in a modern environment, but so for example, if you are a hunter-gatherer in African savannas, there are predatory cats that live in trees. Leopards live in trees, right? And probably there's no leopard in that tree over there. But I could walk a little bit around the tree and not be in danger of being leapt on by a leopard, or I could walk right under the low branches of the tree and be in danger of being leapt on by a leopard. But the probability is very high that there is no leopard, right? So, but I still might feel a little bit uneasy going underneath that tree. And that uneasiness can be the product of an adaptation that was designed by selection, because we have to adjust the costs and benefits of various actions with the probability to make decisions that don't end up killing us. So it only has to be a leopard in that tree once for me to become leopard food. So if the cost of my going a few feet around it is small, why not go around it? There are lots of things that I do, at least, knowing that the probability of something bad happening is incredibly small. That the sane part of me will know that, but still, other parts of me will want to, if the cost is small enough, not take the risk. That's, I don't know if you want to call adjusting your signal detection threshold metaphorically true, or metaphorically, actually false. But see, if you think about it, the behavior is not just a function of, let's say that you have a perfectly designed Bayesian machine in your head. And let's say that machine is estimating probabilities excellently, probabilities of different events. Let's say it has a very accurate estimation of the probability of various events, including ones that might be lethal. Your actual behavior will not be a function only of that, because there's the costs of different errors. There's a cost of a false alarm, where I'm worried that something's going to happen that's probably not going to happen. And there's a cost of a miss, where I thought something was going to not happen and it does happen. Something bad happens that something bad happens that I did not anticipate. And so the behavior that I manifest is going to be a function of both my accurate representation of the world, if I have a mechanism that's doing it, and the estimation of the costs of the two kinds of errors that I can make, the false alarms and the misses. Apparently, I just saw, that Uber or self-driving car in Arizona that horribly ran over a woman there? I just saw the claim that actually there was an issue in its software, that the car did detect the woman, but it was classified as a false positive. Sometimes, a machine will detect something, but the thing's not actually there. And it decided to classify the input as a false positive, that there really wasn't a person there, and that's why it didn't take action to avoid hitting her. Where you set that threshold on, is this a false positive or is this an actual case of a human being on the road, that's going to be really important to the software. Is it a bug or not a bug in the software? Well, it kind of depends on how cautious it depends on the costs and the benefits of the behavior, right? Because you don't want every large insect that flies by to be categorized as a person in the road, so that the cars are just stopping randomly as insects are flying by or as a bird flutters by, on the one hand. So it does have to decide that some things are false positives. On the other hand, you really don't want it hitting people. And that's a signal detection problem of where you're going to set your threshold. Natural selection's done that for us for lots of mechanisms. And we have evolved prior probabilities in lots of our mechanisms of different kinds of events, which are then calibrated by the particular environment we find ourselves in, Santa Barbara is, leopard free. As far as I know, there are no leopards in Santa Barbara, and I'm sure I walk under many more trees in Santa Barbara than your typical person living in the middle of East Africa does. So yeah, our behavior, you brought up the cross-cultural variation issue earlier. Cross-cultural variations can be caused by a lot of different things. mechanisms that are calibrated to different environments by the experiences that we have, the different kinds of knowledge that we build from particular experiences. You can also find patterns of variation that come because we have alternative programs that are activated by cues. So here's a concrete example that has to do with sharing and fairness in sharing. When hunter-gatherers, when they're foraging and there's high variance due to bad luck, like in hunting, people will come back with nothing a lot of the time. When there's high variance due to bad luck, they pool their risk. So you come back with an antelope today from a hunt, and I came back with nothing. You share that with me today, and then when there's a reversal of fortune on a different day, and you come back with nothing, and I come back with something, I share it with you. We store the food in the form of a social obligation. We pool the risk, and so with things where the outcome, where bad luck can play a large role, people have this spontaneous impulse to share widely. When variance is low and due to how much effort we put in, like I spent hours digging for those tubers and you were off laying in the sun. We don't have such a big impulse to share those things. We tend to share those through specific reciprocation relationships or just with our families. So that's a case where you'll have different patterns of sharing, even within a society for different kinds of goods, but also you'll see different patterns across societies depending on how much people experience outcomes as due to bad luck versus insufficient effort. So, the bad luck situation activates sharing rules that are more like Marx's from each according to his ability to each according to his needs kind of sharing, right? But the low effort one doesn't activate that same set of sharing rules. So this is another source of variation between domains or between resources within a culture, but also it can be across cultures, depending on how much your life is determined by awful luck. We live in, we live right now in a market economy where, both still play a role, but some of the role, it's not as precarious as, if you're a hunter-gatherer and you're coming back with nothing 60% of the time, that's not uncommon in hunter-gatherers to come back with no meat 60% of the time. That's a lot of outcomes due to bad luck. So that's a case where you have alternative programs that govern sharing, but they're activated by cues, the perception of outcomes due to luck versus effort.
Sorry to interrupt you there, but there was this study, I can't remember the name of the authors now, but they compared the attitudes people have in the US and I think people from Sweden toward the
Denmark.
Homeless Denmark.
Denmark.
Okay, you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yes, that's one of my colleagues, yeah. This is Michael Bang-Petersen. Michael Bang-Petersen is a political scientist at Aarhus in Denmark. And yes, he turned Danes into Americans and Americans into Danes. What he did was, you've got the Danish welfare state and you've got the US, which is less so. And typically, if you ask about support for social welfare, redistribution for social welfare, typically there's more support in Denmark than there is in the US for it. But he points out that also the stereotype that people have in both places of your typical welfare recipient is different. In Denmark, the stereotype is more that the person's on welfare due to temporary bad luck, whereas in the US, it's more that the person wasn't trying, wasn't making an effort. So what he did was, to test that hypothesis, he created little situations. So he said to people, imagine a man who's on social welfare. He's worked hard his whole life. He's always had a job that he's worked hard at. He's was injured on his most recent job, and so he's been on social welfare, but he's very anxious to get back to work. And they asked about your support for social welfare for that man. Danes and Americans are identical. They both are like the idea of social welfare for this man. If on the other hand you say, imagine a man, he's never really had a steady job, and he really doesn't really want one. He's on social welfare now because he hasn't really looked, and he doesn't have much interest in finding a job. And then you ask about how in favor of social welfare are you for this man. Both have lower, are much less in favor of social welfare for this man than for the other man, and there's no difference between the US and Denmark. And so what Michael's argument is that what you're seeing as the cultural difference is a difference in your default assumptions about how likely the person is to be in need because of bad luck versus effort. But when you when you set the situation and you provide the information about why that person is in that situation, then the cultural difference goes away between the two places. So that's an example exactly of what I'm talking about. John and I called this a long time ago evoked culture. That you can have lots of reasons for all culture. Culture is just a word that refers to within group similarities and between group differences. And those patterns of similarities and differences can have many different causes. It can be, as you were saying, the particulars of the environment that you're living in, how it calibrates particular mechanisms in your head. It can be perceptions of luck versus effort, turning on or off different programs in your head. It can also, of course, there can be elements of cultural transmission, like when we were talking about the spread of religious ideas, supernatural ideas with Pascal Boyer's work. Obviously, there's cultural transmission. It's not false that there's cultural transmission from person to person, and some ideas are very contagious and some ideas not so much. But part of understanding what ideas spread easily from mind to mind and which ones don't, part of that explanation is what kinds of mechanisms are in our heads. That some ideas are very easy to understand and interesting and spread easily. Other ideas are much harder to understand, and they stay limited to, so quantum mechanics, hard to understand, stays limited to specialists who work on it. I mean, people know that it exists, but most people would not be able to explain it. Other ideas can much more easily spread from mind to mind. So part of modeling cultural evolution is going to be, I'm not that fond of the term cultural evolution, because it seems to me often people are talking about history. But part of modeling cultural change is going to require understanding how the mind was designed. But that's not the only thing. There are things that happen that you can't understand only with individual minds, right? I mean, in economics, the law of supply and demand and how that sets prices, that doesn't reduce to an individual mind. It's something that that's an actual emergent property of many people exchanging, and lots of people talk about emergent properties, and sometimes I don't know what they're talking about. But that's a case where there really is an emergent property when you have many people engaged in exchange with people they don't know, and it's a real outcome of decisions in aggregate by suppliers and people who want to buy the things that they supply. What kinds of institutions people like to live under or not is also going to depend on properties of the human mind. It's also going to depend on what some of my colleagues call the epidemiology of representations. What epidemiological properties of a given group of people? What are the other things going on in that group of people that will make certain kinds of institutions more stable and others? And there are people who work on things like that, and it's very interesting. My hope is that there's many more things in the future where when people are trying to model that they're bringing together that with models of evolved psychology, insofar as we know them. So yes, all of those things contribute to cultural differences, all of them, all the time.
Yeah, and because our evolved psychology is at the basis of our human culture, would you say that perhaps one of the reasons why stereotypes are at least sometimes partially true is because they can also occur as an emergent property of people interacting with each other, and because they share the same underlying psychological mechanisms?
Yeah, they can. It can. I mean, sometimes, I mean, a stereotype is basically an inference made based on membership in a category. So I have a stereotype of vegetables as green. But the fact that I have a stereotype of vegetables as green doesn't mean I don't know carrots are orange, and so forth. Yeah, we're going to have all kinds of stereotypes of different people and of different cultures and so forth that are going to be, estimates of what's likely to be true when we don't have further information. When people get further information, usually they go with the further information, because why would I use out-of-date information about somebody when I know them and I see how they really are? So yeah, I mean, yes, absolutely. There's going to be the tendency to form categories is everywhere in everybody, and so is the ability to differentiate members of those categories. I personally, yeah, people may differ in how easily they let go of certain category-based information versus individuating information. So some people might very quickly change their mind when they get to know one or two people from a group that they're not that familiar with. Other people might take more time. That's a question for the social psychologists who study those things.
Yeah. And so do you think that one of the ways culture influences perhaps the way our cognitive modules deal with information is that culture provides us with more sources for rationalizing our behavior?
I don't know if it provides more sources. I think people across cultures are pretty good at rationalizing their behavior. I mean, I'm sure you know these studies, for example, on moral dumbfounding, like that Jonathan Haidt does, where he describes a situation of brother-sister incest, and he asks people whether they think it's morally wrong or not, but he specifies that this was all consensual, that 2 forms of birth control were used, nobody will ever know, this is the only time it'll happen, etc. And then people will say, oh no, that's wrong. And they'll say, why? And then they'll say, well, because, they could have a child that has genetic problems. And they go, but we're specifying here that they are using 2 forms of birth control. You could even specify that one of them is sterile. And people say, well, still wrong. Why? Well, because other people will know. Say, but this is a case where they're never going to tell anybody and nobody will ever know. And then people will finally, you take away all the reasons that people say, and they'll say, I just know it's wrong. And he argues that we have mechanisms, I would argue too, that we have mechanisms that give us a sense of disgust at the idea of brother-sister, sex between brothers and sisters, and that's just part of our evolved architecture, and that all these reasons are a kind of an after-the-fact rationalization of the fact that we have this strong intuition that that's just wrong. So I don't think that's unique to our society. I don't think you necessarily need a complex market economy to have rationalizations for things. I think people pretty much everywhere have lots of rationalizations for things. People will say, like people who believe in witchcraft and so forth, like the roof, the thatched roof of a hut will collapse. And people will say, it was that witch in the other village who did that. And the anthropologists, I can't remember who it was, but there's a famous conversation between an anthropologist. And the anthropologist says, come on, you know that there were lots of termites in that roof and that they've been eating away at that roof. I mean, isn't it more likely that it collapsed because of that? And they'll say, well, of course it collapsed because of that. Of course the termites were eating the roof and it made it weak and made it collapse. That's not the point. The point is, why did it collapse at that moment when so-and-so was in the hut and it hurt so-and-so? That's what the witch did, right? Um, so, so people have, in all societies, people have all kinds of rationalizations for the things that they think. Both the things that they think that are true and the things that they think that are false. We have rationalizations for all of it.
Yeah. So, and I mean, if all that is part of human culture, and all that the human mind can create is the result of this evolved cognitive apparatus, wouldn't you say that, in a sense, we are also at least partially adapted to the environments we ourselves create?
Of course. Yeah. Some of them more easily than others. And also sometimes we create and we change even when an environment is very much outside the envelope of natural conditions. We sometimes shape that environment so that it's more so. So right now I'm in a hotel and in Chile, and it's got you can't see it, but there's a lot of light coming in from outside. The ceiling, I don't know if you can tell, but the ceiling is made of natural wood. It's at a slope that's kind of like a tree canopy, sort of like the slope of tree canopy. There's lots of open spaces. There's some plants in here. It's the designer or architects created it to be a space that a species like us feels more comfortable in than a concrete box with no windows and no. There's other kinds of tree canopy, like there's a second. I can't tell if you can see, but there's a second floor mezzanine, so you can feel like you're up in the trees looking down. We often shape environments so that they have some elements of the environments that we did evolve in, and it makes us much more comfortable in those environments than we might otherwise have been. So yes, of course, one of the main things we're adapted to is other people and things other people produce.
Yeah. And do you think that evolutionary psychology could be effectively deployed in trying to improve politics, in the sense that if our political leaders were to know more about how the human mind works and with what kind of creatures they're dealing with, and how to best make people to cooperate with each other, maybe, so that their governance could produce better results at a societal scale?
I hope so. I wouldn't claim that we know enough right now to know exactly how to do that, and also how to do that depends on the particular institutions in a given country as well. But yeah, no, I hope so. I mean, knowing that we have some of these ways of thinking. Causality in a complex market economy is often very puzzling. I mean, it's often very different than what our evolved mind tells us. So, an interesting case is the case of, there used to be big arguments in the United States about homelessness. And the arguments were all about, were people homeless due to bad luck? Or were they homeless due to being lazy, or having a mental illness, which is sort of a combination of the two in a way. And nobody argued about what followed from that. The assumption was, if it's due to bad luck, then we should all pitch in and help them out. If it's due to somebody not making an effort, then they don't deserve our help. So it's like people argued about the premise, not what follows for the premise. At the same time, there was a study that was done of causes of homelessness across the United States. I think it was William Tucker who did this study. And what he was finding is he looked at all kinds of things that could predict homelessness, like poverty levels, crime rates, weather. Nice weather, you'd expect more homelessness and horrible weather, all kinds of things. And he found that only 2 variables came out as significant in his regressions. The first variable was weather. So you have more homelessness where it's sunny and nice, like in California, than in Minnesota, say, where all else equal, where it's freezing cold in winter. And the other one was the presence of rent control. Where there was rent control, now nobody who voted for rent control did it because they wanted to create homelessness, right? That was not the goal. People who voted for rent control were thinking, oh, there's people that can't, the prices have gotten really high here, there's people that can't afford to live here, we need to have some way that people can afford to live here, right? So good motives, right? But in a market economy, a policy can have perverse effects. And one of the perverse effects was that it dried up, the supply of housing became very limited. People converted rental units to condos, or they didn't keep up the rental unit because they couldn't afford to keep up the rental unit, so it just, everything broke down. People didn't build new rental units. And so what was happening is some neighborhoods, this happened in the Bronx, I believe, just deteriorated over time and became just a mess and just didn't have a big housing supply anymore, and more homeless people as a result. Now that's one of these things where it has to do with actual, you were talking about metaphorical truth and truth.
Literal truth. Yeah.
Literal truth. There are literal facts about market economies that where some policies will have an effect that's just completely different than what you intended. And it's really important to know what those effects are. And it's really important to, when you're trying to figure out policies that will actually help somebody, to know what those effects are, right? Because it's not good enough, I think, it's not good enough to say, oh, I want to help homeless people, and then do something that ends up making people homeless. That's not the point. The point is not to make you feel good. Yeah. The point is to actually help homeless people, in which case you have to do something that helps homeless people. So like a lot of people, they claim to be morally consequentialists, but then they don't bother to study consequences, right? If you're going to be a consequentialist, you should study consequences, and you need to know consequences in the society you live in. If you live in an advanced market economy, you should take some freaking economics, for God's sakes. You should pay attention to, because there are people who study these causal processes, and they're often different than what our minds evolved for a small hunter-gatherer group of 50 to 200 people imagines. Right? I mean, we imagine the effects of things that we do. We're designed for a world in which the intentions of the people around us are really important, play a very important role in what actually happens. Right? And in large, complex societies, often the intentions don't have very much to do with what happens, the intentions of particular people. I mean, this was one of Adam Smith's points, right? One of Adam Smith's points was that I don't get bread from the baker and candles from the candlestick maker because of their general benevolence towards me, but they end up providing these things, a process where their benevolence doesn't have to play a role. Those things get produced because of what happens in an economy of the kind that he was living in Scotland in the 1700s.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Yes. So yes, to your question, could government be done better if people knew some evolutionary psychology? Yes, but not just evolutionary psychology, right? Economics, a lot of other things as well. Study of institutions. I don't think anybody has any idea how most institutions work or what parts of them work or why they work. A guy who taught business ethics a number of years ago told me that he often lectures in Beijing, and that what he would sometimes do, this was like about, 10 or 15 years ago, I don't know what things are like now, but what he would do is in Beijing, he would pull out a credit card, and he would show it to the students, and he'd say, if I were in West Germany, I could go to a car rental place. They would take an imprint of my credit card, and they would give me a Mercedes-Benz that I could drive around. And these people are like laughing at him, but that's absurd, because obviously you can't do that because you wouldn't bring it back. What do you mean? You're going to give an imprint of a card and you're going to bring back the Mercedes-Benz? That's absurd, right? And he was telling him, no, really. and I would end up bringing it back. And okay, so, but the question is, why would he bring it back? There are many reasons he'd bring it back. One might be internalized norms about what he should do, but there's a lot of other things too, like there's a police force that's going to come after him if he just takes the car and never brings it back. There's insurance companies that have a stake in this and have their own investigators and are going to make sure that doesn't happen, and they're going to make him pay insurance up front. There's all these layers of institutions that we live with that involve the enforcement of contracts and that involve there are real consequences to certain kinds of bad behavior. And we actually don't know, of all these different institutions that exist, I have no idea which are the ones that are most relevant to the fact that he would bring the car back. It's not just that I don't know, nobody knows, because it's very hard to do the experiment. The ideal experiment would be you have a lot of societies where everything else is held equal, and you remove one institution at a time and see what happens. Who knows? But I mean, that's one of these things that's I don't know if it's underappreciated, because I'm sure it's well appreciated in certain areas of economics and political science and certain areas of sociology and so on. I think just for everyday people on the street, I think it's an underappreciated problem or question, which institutions make the most difference. I don't know.
And so and now another question: how could we apply, or in what ways could we apply evolutionary psychology to the betterment of human relationships? Because sometimes I discuss with people about this, and the question comes to mind: what could I do, men and women, to make my marriage to last longer? And what I usually tell them is that for the man, never earn less than your wife, and for the woman, never get fat. But that's because I'm a horrible person, okay? So, and that's why I'm asking you this.
Okay. Are you married?
No.
Okay. Okay. I think understanding some of your own psychology gives you more insight into why you might be feeling the way you are, and allows you to think, well, is this? I'm trying to think of a good. Here's a possible example. This is an example. I don't know if it's true or not true. Okay, it's a hypothetical example. It may be that obviously we evolved in a world where there's possibility of disease and infertility and so forth. It may be that our minds are designed so that when you marry somebody, you form a long-term pair bond with somebody, that if a child is not conceived within 3 or 4 years, that starts to make you think that wears on the marriage, that it wears on it. And we may have adaptations that interpret that as, oh, there's an infertility problem, maybe I should switch mates. I don't know if this is true or not true. I'm just giving a thought experiment. So let's say that might mean you might be using birth control, right? But still, if you're not conceiving, maybe it's to do with the birth control for a certain number of years, that might start to wear on the marriage and make you think about switching mates. You can, if that were, if this were true about the mind and you knew it, you might be able to step back for a second and say, wait a minute, has my husband become uniquely annoying in the last year? Or is he the same as he's always been? And I'm feeling a little bit like I'm finding more problems because of this other issue. Like we're not conceiving, and that's maybe affecting the way that I'm seeing my marriage. You can ask yourself questions like that. You can also ask yourself questions like, well, let's say you are trying to conceive and not having a child, and it's causing problems. You can also ask yourself, well, are there technologies that will help us to have a child because I really want a child, or do I love this person so much that it doesn't matter if we have a child or don't have a child, and so I'm having an awareness of that you might be feeling this way for this other reason can help you say, okay, no, I love this person with all my heart. I can acknowledge that I have that feeling, but then let it go and not let it determine the rest of my life. I think there are a lot of things that having insight into why you're feeling the way you do can help you understand everything going on in your life and allow you to make choices that, whatever your own values are, make choices that better fulfill your values. Some of our work recently has been on anger and on the design of anger. And the idea is that the specific trigger of anger is when you feel that another person is not putting as much weight on your welfare as you think that you deserve given the nature of your relationship. So it's not like, have they imposed a cost on me? My favorite example is, let's say that I have a really beautiful, expensive silk scarf. And let's say that you grabbed it and because your daughter's arm was bleeding and to make a tourniquet for your daughter. I'm not going to be mad at you because the benefit to you is so huge that it doesn't say anything about how much you weigh, how much weight you put on my welfare. You would have done that even if you valued me highly. You would have done that because it's so important to you. On the other hand, if you impose the same cost on me, you ruined my beautiful scarf, but you did it to wipe ketchup off your face, I'm probably going to get mad because the benefit to you is so small, right, that you must not put very much weight on my welfare to have imposed a cost of that size on me for such a tiny benefit to yourself. And so it's not the cost somebody imposes per se that makes a person mad. It's for what benefit to themselves did they impose it? Because if it was for too small a benefit, that may mean that in making decisions about how to live their own life, they're going to be imposing costs on you all the time that are not merited by the nature of your relationship, and you need to turn up the dial in their head of how much weight they should be putting on your welfare. And so, usually when people get angry, the first thing that happens is they have an information exchange, sometimes known as an argument. And the nature of the argument is, do you understand how big a cost you imposed on me? And you did it for such a small benefit to yourself? And then you would say, no, actually that was not a small benefit to me. That was hugely important to me. I wouldn't have been able to get to my job interview in time, and I would have lost that job and so forth if I hadn't. And so or I might say, you did this to me. And you might say, that was to you? I didn't realize that was going to happen to you. In which case I know that it wasn't intentional, that the inference that you don't put weight on my welfare is not justified if you didn't know that it was going to be me that was going to be harmed. So it's very funny because once you know about this theory, you can understand lots of things that people do that are making you that are making you annoyed versus not, and why. And sometimes you realize, wait a minute, I'm really not being fair to this other person. I'm really not being fair. Or you realize, wait a minute, why is this person always, you know, they really don't put much weight on my welfare, and then you might do something to change that. I find that this particular theory of anger, it keeps being useful all the time, even though the anger system is there and it's tripped by these circumstances without necessarily having conscious awareness of why. There's something about understanding what's going on about somebody not putting enough weight on your welfare that, I don't know, it helps me manage my social relationships in what I think of as a more productive way. And I think there's lots of theories in evolutionary psychology that can help in those ways. I think it helps a lot in marriages, because in a marriage it's a very long-term cooperative relationship.
Yeah.
And there's going to be a big problem, and it's also one where you have a lot of common fate through your child especially. And there's going to be a lot of cases where you might not feel the person's putting enough weight on your welfare, or vice versa, where that needs to be recalibrated, or that needs to be somehow negotiated, or the marriage will fail. So I think there's lots of things that can, besides what you said, that can make a difference. I mean, some of the things you said won't help as you age, right?
Yeah.
It won't help as you age.
Yeah.
But other things may become other priorities. So yeah, I think it can help with lots of different parts of life. But right now, I try more to just figure out how the mind works, and hope that other generations will figure out how to put this to good use.
Yeah, but I think you have kind of an optimist view of how people can apply evolutionary psychology to their own perverse means. Because when you're like me and you are on the 35th percentile in terms of agreeableness, you apply evolutionary psychology, but in this sense, I want to be mean to this person, and then I will justify it on the basis of my evolutionary cognitive models. So, I don't know, I want to be mean to you. That's because you're fat, it's your fault. If you're pretty, then, so, yeah. And it's not my fault. It's only my subconscious cognitive modules.
You also have better representational abilities to think counterfactually and suppositionally and consider different courses of action for the future. That's part of your evolved design too.
Yeah, that's true. But when you're on the 35th percentile of agreeableness, you don't care about that.
So is this why you became the dissenter?
Yeah, I guess that's one of the reasons why.
Somebody's got to do it.
Yeah.
Somebody's got to raise dissent.
Yeah. And someone has to say, wait a minute. Okay, we know that men treat better people, women who are pretty. But is this really a bad thing? That's the question. Because you already have your moral foundation set, and if you're a liberal, you're going to say it's bad. But Jonathan Knight talks about that. So.
Well, you could also do it the other way, where you could say, wait a minute, am I being less kind to this person because she's less attractive? Is this merited? Especially if you're hiring the person. Am I giving this person, am I making excuses for this other person because she is attractive and really actually she's not very good at the job I want to hire her for? It can be used for good or evil.
Unless you're part of human resources and you have to fire people, then it's a pleasure to do that.
I can tell you're a little higher in punitive sentiment than many people.
Okay. Okay. So, and I mean, I guess that the picture we get about human nature from evolutionary psychology is that we can't really talk about human nature in terms of it being good or bad, right?
Right, right. A lot of in a lot of fields, like in political science, a lot of times political differences come down to, do you think human nature is fundamentally good, in which case you're a liberal, or fundamentally bad, in which case you're a conservative? And I don't think human nature is fundamentally anything. I think it's fundamentally a collection of adaptations that execute their functions. And some of these adaptations create amazingly wonderful things. So we have adaptations for cooperation that most species don't have. And these adaptations assume repeated interactions. And they assume them even in environments where we interact more often in one-shot interactions. This makes us so much more cooperative than we would otherwise be. It produces all kinds of goods and services we wouldn't otherwise have. We have parental love. That's an adaptation too. We also have adaptations that cause us to want to hurt people, or to sometimes, initiate a raid and take things by force from people. We have all of these adaptations, and they are turned on and off by different constellations of circumstances. Knowing what they are like can tell you something about, if you know. So just take the warfare one. Let's just take in-group, out-group psychology. Obviously, people are not at war all the time, right? Nobody in Santa Barbara is at war right now. Some parts of the world, endemic warfare. When your coalitional psychology is activated and you start thinking in terms of us versus them in a zero-sum way, you act very differently than if you're in positive sum interactions, right? If you've understood the way our coalitional psychology works and what activates that, and what throws you into this zero-sum, us versus them mentality, then part of that understanding is understanding what circumstances trigger it, what circumstances make one feel that way. And that can help you create social arrangements in which people are not always in a war of all against all. That can help you create a society that's not always triggering your us versus them psychology. So in principle, it could help you create circumstances. I mean, in principle, how exactly you do this, I don't know. But create circumstances that are much less likely to lead to war or gang violence or other sorts of things that most people really don't like to be around. But it's only when you understand the mind that you're going to be able to do that. It's just like, it's of no use with eyesight to say, oh, I'm nearsighted, that's terrible. What am I going to do? No, yeah, some things are terrible. War is terrible. Bad eyesight is annoying. But saying, oh, it's terrible, so I want to deny there's such a thing as bad eyesight, that's stupid, right? Denying that something bad exists doesn't provide a way of fixing it. And if you instead understand how the eye works, you know what? You can do this. You can create glasses, you can grind lenses, you can create contact lenses, you can do laser surgery, you can have lenses put into your cornea, you can do all kinds of things to improve the eyesight. But you can only do that if you understand how the mechanism works. And no amount of bemoaning things is going to help, as opposed to having a causal understanding of how the mechanism works. And I think that's true for all of the mechanisms that regulate our social behavior as well. So saying, oh, it's terrible that war exists. Yes, it's terrible that war exists. That's bad. But you want to understand what is activating the mechanisms that cause you to see the world in a certain way, or what makes the world a certain way. That's what you need to understand if you really want to change that. So I have very little patience with people who just bemoan things and then say, because I don't like something, I'm going to deny that it has any foundations in human nature. I'm going to deny that I'm going to think that humans are angels who, it's only civilization that corrupts them into behaving badly towards other people. And if only we were back in a state of nature, living in the forest or the savannas, everybody would be being sweet, kind to each other. Come on. No. No. Not that. That's not going to be helpful. Being clear-eyed and understanding human nature and understanding how these mechanisms work, that's going to be your best hope of creating the society that you want to live in. Not going like that.
Yeah, or then again, the other alternative would be to embrace the terrible, embrace your toxic masculinity, and go ahead with it.
I suppose that is another alternative.
Yeah, but I mean, isn't it interesting that people who study psychology, in comparison to people who don't do it, have a better sense about if they were in the proper circumstances that they could act as any other person in those circumstances would act. And I mean, there are times where people say things, for example, that if they were part of Nazi Germany, they wouldn't go along with the crowd. But
maybe they would.
Yeah.
I think the Milgram experiments were on obedience to authority were done for that reason. And people were very, very surprised by how much obedience to authority there was. I think some people say, oh, well, that was an unethical experiment. And, well, not debriefing subjects at the end. He should have debriefed subjects at the end about the deception involved. But that's an incredibly valuable experiment because it allows people to see that there's a capacity in them that they did not know existed before and that they might want to attend to. If I can, you said toxic masculinity. Can I defend men for just a second here?
Yeah, of course. I'm against the concept. So.
A basic evolutionary principle is when the two sexes have the same adaptive problem to solve, you expect the mechanisms that solve those problems to be very similar or the same. And when there are different adaptive problems to solve, you expect there to be mechanisms that are designed differently in men and women. And there are some problems evolutionarily that fell differentially on men versus women. One of them is warfare and protection against physical aggression from other men, from other communities. Protection also from predators. Hunting dangerous animals. These are all selection pressures that fell differentially on men ancestrally versus in women. And men have adaptations that have to do with that. And they are not all toxic, right? I mean, my father was in the Pacific Campaign in World War II, and he was in the battles of Okinawa and Leyte, two of the worst battles of World War II. My father knew how to kill a person with his bare hands. He has that ability. He never used that against me or my mother. We knew that if anybody tried to hurt us, he would kill them first. He would never let anybody hurt us. So he had a component of what people might now call toxic masculinity. I don't know if they'd call it toxic or not toxic, but my father was strong. He had warrior abilities. He had been a warrior. He used that in our defense. He didn't use that to harm us. Men have interesting properties that are sometimes very surprising to women that we don't necessarily understand. Like you mentioned the upper body strain thing. We've done some research in our lab that has to do with how that calibrates mechanisms in men. And one of the things that was very funny that I realized as we were doing this research is we once went around the room and asked men versus women the question, like, so you ask men, when a man enters the room that you've never met before, what do you think? And every man in the room said, my first question is, can I take him? You know, like if there were a fight, could I take him? It didn't matter which man it was. It didn't matter if he was small, big, strong, not strong. Every one of them said, they admitted, sometimes sheepishly, that that's the first thought. Can I take him? Not one woman in the room has that thought when another woman, not one of us has the thought when another woman enters the room, can I take her? You know, like, and you know, it's a somewhat strange world that men live in to a certain extent. I mean, there are these things that are part of man world that I'm actually kind of grateful that I don't have to deal with. You know, I mean, men have a lot of competitive interactions with one another that are sometimes difficult to negotiate. It's not that there's no competition between women, but what competition there is, it's very different. I mean, some of what creates masculinity is, or some of what people talk about as toxic masculinity. I don't always know what they mean by toxic, but some of it is also what makes men want to take care of their children and want to take care of their spouse and want to protect them and want to feed them. I don't think that's toxic. I'm glad that John, he doesn't have to take care of me because we make about the same income, but I'm glad that he wants to. He doesn't have to, but it's touching it's touching to me that he views it as part of his relationship to me and my daughter, that part of that is taking care of us. I honor that about him. I don't think that's toxic. Part of my relationship to him is wanting to take care of him and take care of our daughter. Is that toxic femininity? I don't. I think sometimes seeing the context in which seeing ways in which men's and women's minds are the same and different can be really interesting, and to an extent that we often don't realize. And I think that understanding some of the roots of it is sometimes an act of both humility and mercy, of trying to understand why somebody is the way they're. If you watch a playground with elementary school children, you'll see two things. One is you'll see more of the girls playing in pairs than the boys. The boys will be running around in groups, little warrior parties. They're being like little warrior gangs. And the girls are not doing that. They're doing something different. And here's another bizarre thing. On the jungle gym, you know, these things where you can climb up, you'll see almost all girls at the top, not boys. Apparently, there's Richard Koss at UC Davis has studied this for years. There are apparently adaptations in that with a long phylogenetic history that are still present in females that have to do with an evolutionary history where you could stay a lot of primates sleep in the trees at night. But to sleep in trees at night, you have to balance out in certain ways with the branches. Your feet have to have a certain kind of splay to them, and so forth. And in a lot of primates, it's the females spend more time in the trees than the males. And he claims that there are aspects of the morphology of feet and legs in women, and that this evolutionary history of women, also they're lighter and the weight's distributed differently. They can spend more time out in the trees than men could. And that's still part of our psychology today. So often little girls are the ones climbing the trees and on top of the jungle gyms. And he even finds this in nightmares, that in nightmares, in boys and girls, the boys are being attacked from the sides or above. Girls in their nightmares are attacked from the sides, up from above and from below, which is something that can only happen if you're in a tree. Now that's all very bizarre and weird, and this man has mountains of converging evidence for this. It's weird. It is kind of adorable. And I guarantee you, if you go to a playground, you're going to see this. That's one of in addition to seeing the boys running around in little warrior gangs, doing coalitional cooperation games, like having a little war party or a hunting party, whichever you want to think about it. But they're coordinating as a group to accomplish a common goal. Sometimes the common goal is annoying those guys over there, and sometimes the common goal is something that would be more akin to hunting or something. And you'll see the girls doing more dyadic kinds of cooperative activities, and you'll see them up on the jungle gym. Does that mean you'll never see a boy on the jungle gym? No, of course, sometimes you'll see a boy on the jungle gym. Does that mean you'll never see girls playing coalitional games? Of course you'll see girls playing coalitional games. But there'll be these general patterns, and it's interesting to note them, and it's interesting to think about them, about where they came from. Anyway,
Yeah.
So those little boys, they're preparing for a life that probably they won't live, of intergroup warfare and cooperative hunting. But it's useful to understand that. It's useful to understand that somebody may have, that somebody male might have motivational systems that find some aspects of that kind of group cooperation rewarding. And they may enjoy things like coalitional sports, team sports a lot. I mean, girls enjoy team sports too, but there may be an on-average difference. Maybe that by understanding that aspect of our evolutionary history, you can create circumstances where people feel that they're living their life more fully. I don't like when people call other people toxic. I don't like it about sex differences. I don't like. I don't like. I just don't like it, and I don't think it's helpful. I don't think I don't think it helps women. It's not that men never do awful things to women. Yeah. Men have a history of doing many awful things to women, but I don't think labeling something as toxic is helpful. So, yeah. Anyway, that's my defense of men for the time being.
Yeah, but earlier you were saying, like, when men go into a bar and women go into a bar, women look at men and they say, and they think in their minds, could I take him? And men don't do that with women. They never say, could I take her? But there's a possible situation where that happens. That is when a guy goes into a lesbian bar and there's a lot of masculine lesbians there, and these are liberal women. Then
that I'll leave that analysis to you.
Okay. So, we already went beyond 3 hours. So I had other questions, but I guess I will have to invite you again.
Okay, another day. Yeah. I am starting to lose my voice, but yes.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, but we will have to do this again. So,
you're by the way, you're very, very well informed on the Evo Psych literature.
Okay, I thought you were saying you were going to say that I was funny. So.
You are funny.
But okay. I accept the compliment. Okay.
But I mean, you've obviously read a huge amount of it, which is great.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry.
How much time do you spend? A lot of time doing that? Like reading Evo Psych literature?
Every day.
Okay. All right then. Great.
Okay.
That's good to know.
So yeah.
So at least one person is reading things that we write. At least we know we have an audience of at least one.
Yeah, and at least someone is reading this with the intent of creating havoc. So, I mean, no one does this.
Okay. A little havoc is sometimes necessary.
Yeah.
I prefer to call it viewpoint diversity.
Oh, okay, yeah, that's the politically correct way to put it, I guess. Okay, so just before we say our goodbyes, could you just please tell people, tell them about perhaps some interesting piece of work you're doing now? I don't know if you're active on social media or not, and where people can follow your work.
Well, there's a website of the Center for Evolutionary Psychology. If you Google Center for Evolutionary Psychology, you find it. We try to put new things up there. At the moment, our lab has flooded, and so we're trying to put it back together. And so right now, I can't update it very easily. But we try to keep things there. Some of our work has been recently on what I was telling you about welfare trade-offs, and the idea of that we have mechanisms, we have emotions that are designed to reach into somebody's head and turn the dials on various mechanisms in their head, like when I was talking about anger as the activation of a system that is designed to negotiate for better treatment, and to increase the we call it a welfare trade-off parameter or welfare trade-off ratio, to increase the amount of weight that you put on my welfare in making your own decisions. We've been working, that's with Erin Sell. We've been working with Daniel Sneezer on shame, and the idea that shame is also the expression of an adaptation. That if you live in a small interdependent society, it matters whether people devalue you, whether it matters how much weight they put on your welfare in making decisions. It'll have an impact on your life, and it can have a very bad one if they decide that you're not worth taking into consideration, or they want to ostracize you, things like that. So the idea is that shame is one of the functions of shame is prospectively, before you act, there'll be something that you could do, and maybe it has positive payoffs of some kind for you, but also maybe it'll cause other people to devalue you, to negatively evaluate you in a way that has long-term bad consequences for you. So the idea is that the emotion of shame, that it's an internal representation of how much do I think I would be devalued by people if I do that, so that in making decisions that can be compared to, well, is it still worth it for me to do that, right? You'll always have to, there's always going to be a decision, a trade-off like that to be made. And that the emotion of shame also, if you actually do something that would cause other people to devalue you, it activates certain motivations and behaviors, like staying out of people's sight for a while until things calm down. That causes you to prevent we call it information threat, the transmission of the bad information that may make you have subordination display. If you want to communicate that, yes, I understand that what I did was really bad, and I shouldn't have, and I'm going to do better in the future. There are aspects of shame that communicate that, and so the idea is that, again, that's that part of that's from the function of shame is to calibrate your own behavior for the social environment that you're in, so that you maintain your social relationships with other people in a way that's useful. So we've been interested in this notion that the function of some emotions, I mean, things like fear are kind of different, right? Predator fear, or fear of somebody who's trying to aggress against you, that has its own functions. But the idea is that some of these social a function of calibrating variables in your own head and in other people's heads to manage your social relationships. So that's one of the things that we've been working on a lot for the last few years. I kind of sometimes forget everything we're working on because, well, we work with different people on different things. I have some colleagues where I'm working on moral psychology, and but those are two of the things that we've been doing most. Oh, we've been very interested in well, let me not go there. Well, no, there's these issues about the psychology of cooperation. And some people claim that the fact that people are generous in a dictator game and these behavioral economic games is somehow inconsistent with any evolutionary theory and with Homo economicus economic theories, etc. It may be that, but we have minds that are designed for a small-scale world of repeated interactions, and so it's nothing puzzling to most evolutionary psychologists, people being generous even when you tell them it's a one-shot game and you tell them it's anonymous. But then the people who have this other view, sort of cultural group selection people, say, but you don't have a model. So some of my colleagues, Max Krasnow and Andy Dalton, have been creating models that look at this. One of them on the evolution of generosity is specifically about the idea that there are two kinds of errors you can commit in the world in a reciprocity relationship. One error is thinking that it's a one-shot interaction and therefore not cooperating. And other error is thinking it's a repeated interaction and cooperating with somebody where it's actually one shot. It turns out the cost of that is actually pretty low if you're a conditional cooperator. That has a kind of low cost because, yeah, you'll have a one-time cost and then you won't deal with that person again. The cost of thinking that it's a one-shot interaction and so defecting, when actually it's going to be a repeated interaction, is very high because you're missing out on harvesting the benefits of repeated interaction over time. And so in the agent-based simulations that we were doing, you get really, really strong selection for erring on the side of assuming that an interaction is repeated, even when you have a lot of evidence that it's one shot. So in these simulations, you can actually have Bayesian agents that are using Bayes' rule to decide whether an interaction is going to be one shot or repeated. And you can give them innate knowledge of the base rate of one shot versus repeated interactions in the population. So it's accurate. You're talking about truth, and metaphorical truth. You can give them truth about the frequency of one shot versus repeated interactions. You can give these agents knowledge that 70% of the 70% of the interactions in their society will be one shot. And then they get a Q that's for their partner that has a distribution that's associated with whether it's going to be a one shot or repeated interaction. They use that plus the base rate to create a rational belief about the probability this interaction is going to be one shot. And then what evolves is a disposition to cooperate given your rational belief that it's a one-shot interaction. And what evolves is a very strong disposition to cooperate, even though, as a rational Bayesian agent, you believe that this is most likely to be a one-shot interaction. And it's because of the different costs associated with the two mistakes, a miss and a false alarm. And so the model's showing that you expect there to be a bias towards generosity, even when it doesn't. So the economists will say, yes, but I told them that it's one shot and I told them it's anonymous and they believed me. Yeah, that's one Q among many in a lifetime of Qs. Our agents know the base rate and they know the Q, but there's still and it's not like a bias in the bad sense. It's the fitness maximizing choice to be cooperative, even though. So it's not like in some Kahneman and Tversky sense, like a sloppy rule of thumb or a bad bias. It's the most adaptive choice that you can make under the circumstances. So there's things that we've been doing that have to do with agent-based simulations about some of these problems. Most recently, Andy Delton and Max Krasnow have done this very nice thing about showing the cooperation in groups that with group punishment. There's been these puzzles about how do you get the evolution of cooperation in groups sustained by punishment, because the idea is that yes, the punisher may lower the fitness of the free rider, and it may induce the free rider to cooperate in the future, but then everybody in the group is getting that benefit, not just the punisher, but the punisher got the cost of punishing. And so how is that going to be possibly selected for? Because the punisher is that other cooperators are free riding on the fact that the punisher was willing to punish. And it turns out that if you relax just tiny parts of the situation so that you're not always in exactly the same group for your entire life, which who is, so that sometimes you're with these people, sometimes with these people, sometimes with these people, these partially overlapping groups. So you relax that. You give your agents a little bit of memory so that they are capable of, if they were punished, remembering who punished them, remembering which agent punished them. And you allow a variable in the agent's heads that gives them a probability of punishing. So they don't have to punish every single time, every single act of free riding they see every single time it happens. But there can be a probability that they'll punish, and that can evolve. It turns out you very easily get the evolution of punishment and the evolution of cooperation in these sizable groups, because it turns out that the punisher does differentially benefit from their act of punishment, because the free rider, if they're in a group where there's no punishers, they may free ride, but if they're in a group if the next time they're in a group with an individual who punished them in the past, they cooperate. Right? So that it solves the second order free rider problem, because there is no second order free rider problem. The punisher does benefit differentially. So we've been working from different points of view on these questions about the psychology of cooperation and how it's sustained and so on. So those are the things most recently that we've been working on.
Okay, great. So I think it was a great talk we had here. So, and again, I will get in touch with you perhaps in a few months for us to schedule another one. And please, I will end the recording, but please stay on the line, because I just want to have a short word with you. And just for the viewers, before I say my formal goodbyes, I will do as people do here in Portugal. Like I was saying at the beginning in Fatima, when the guys are carrying the Virgin Mary on their backs, and then there's the old ladies there crying and waving their handkerchief. So this one is for the mother of evolutionary psychology.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. If you appreciate my work, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/thedissenter. Thank you.